The water above the Niobrara seabed is warm and bright near the surface, and something more than 30 feet long is turning inside that light. It moves without hurry. A school of small fish scatters ahead of it, silver flecks bending as one, and the great animal adjusts, a long muscular body rolling once on its axis. Below, where the sunlight thins to a green haze and then to nothing, the water lies cold and starved of oxygen. But up here, in the lit and living layer, this is a predator that may weigh tens of thousands of pounds, and it has just decided which way its meal will go. You are watching Mosasaurus, or an animal very like it, in the last great sea of the age of dinosaurs. Settle in. There is no hurry tonight, and there was none for the creature either. Let it turn a moment longer in your mind, a back darker than the depths, a belly paler than the sky, a tail driving in slow sculling strokes. The largest individuals of Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the best known of these animals, carried length estimates that cluster around 39 to 46 feet from careful study of real jaws and skulls. Modelled weights for the biggest run somewhere near 22,000 to 33,000 pounds. Numbers like that are hard to hold. Picture instead a body longer than a city bus, thicker through the chest than a horse is tall, gliding over you at the depth where warm water meets cold. That is the shape we are following into the past, and the past here is deep. The mosasaurs were not a brief experiment. Their dynasty ran for something like 25 million years, and it ended all at once about 66 million years ago. To feel how far away that is, imagine counting the years one per second. You would count for 2 million years before you reached the day the last of them died. The animal you are picturing belonged near the very end of that run, when these lizards had already ruled the water for longer than there have been recognizable primates on land. Lizards. That word matters, and it is easy to skip past. Mosasaurs were not fish. They were not dolphins or whales, which had not yet appeared. They were not the plesiosaurs with their long necks, nor the fish-shaped ichthyosaurs, though they shared the sea with kin of those. Mosasaurs were reptiles, squamates, members of the same broad group that today includes the lizards sunning on a wall and the snakes moving through dry grass. Somewhere in their ancestry was a small animal that walked on land, on 4 ordinary legs, with an ordinary lizard's gait. And then, over long stretches of time, that lineage turned around and walked back into the water it had once crawled out of. That is the thread we will follow first. Not the monster at its full size, but the small beginning that made the monster possible. Because the giant turning in the Niobrara light did not arrive from nowhere. It was the far end of a slow experiment that began at the edge of the water, on a shore, with an animal you could have held in 2 hands. Those small beginners have a name, plesiosaurs. The word points to the shore, and the shore is where they lived. These were slender, semi-aquatic lizards that appear in the fossil record from the late Jurassic and carry on into the Cretaceous, and they looked, at a glance, like ordinary lizards that had taken an interest in the sea. No bigger than a walking stick, some of them. You could have laid one along your forearm with room to spare. They still had 4 working legs. They still had the general build of an animal that could scramble over rock and warm itself in the sun, and dart back to land when something larger came looking. But their lives were bent toward the water. Picture a low coast under a Cretaceous sky, warmer than most coasts you know. The air thick and salt-heavy. Shallow lagoons lie behind a fringe of shoal and reef. In the margins, where the land gives way by inches, a small lizard slips off a sun-warmed stone and into the shallows. It swims with a side-to-side flexing of its body and tail, the way a lizard runs but turns sideways into the water, and it hunts the small soft things that live where salt water meets the shore. Fish fry, soft-bodied swimmers, whatever a quick, sharp-toothed animal the length of a walking stick could catch and swallow. Nothing about that animal announced a giant. It was not the biggest thing on its own beach. It was prey as often as predator, a mouthful for larger reptiles and for the sharks that already patrolled these waters. But it had made a small, consequential choice, generation upon generation. It had begun to spend more of its life wet than dry. And once a lineage commits to the water, the water begins patiently to reshape it. You can see the reshaping if you follow the bones forward in time. The pressures of a swimming life are relentless and specific. A body that spends its hours moving through water is rewarded for becoming smooth, for tucking away anything that catches drag, for turning the tools of walking into the tools of steering. And so the limbs of these animals began, across the generations, to change their meaning. The long bones of the leg shortened and broadened. The many small bones of the hand and foot spread and flattened and were bound together by webbing and flesh. A foot that had once gripped stone became, by slow degree, a paddle. A leg that had once carried weight became a fin that carried direction. None of that happened in a single life, or a single lifetime, or a single 1,000 years. Evolution does not lunge, it leans. Each generation was to itself simply a lizard living an ordinary lizard life, mating and hunting and dying on its warm coast. But the ones whose limbs were a little more paddle-shaped caught a little more food, or escaped a little more often, or ranged a little farther from the dangerous shore into the safer open shallows, and their descendants leaned the same way again. Over millions of years the lean added up to a transformation. The shore dweller became a swimmer. The swimmer became something that need never come ashore at all. That is the pivot, and it is worth resting on, because it is the hinge on which this entire tale turns. Land animals had gone to sea before, and would again, but few lineages made the crossing as completely, or as memorably, as the mosasaurs. The agialosaurs still belong to both worlds, land and water, the way a modern marine iguana does, hauling out to bask and slipping in to feed. Their mosasaur descendants would belong to the water alone. They would lose the shore entirely, and the animal turning in the Niobrara light, 30 feet and more of muscle and dark skin, could no more have crawled up a beach than you could breathe underwater. It was a lizard that had forgotten how to be a lizard on land. We should be honest here about what we know and what we are still arguing over, because the honest uncertainty is part of the pleasure. The broad picture is well supported. Mosasaurs are almost certainly descended from these small semi-aquatic agialosaurs. The transition from shore lizard to sea lizard is written across many fossils, and the direction of travel is not in serious doubt. But when scientists ask a narrower question, picture blurs. The narrower question is this: among all the reptiles alive today, which one is the mosasaur's closest living relative? The answer, as of now, is contested, and calmly so. One line of evidence points toward the monitor lizards, the varanids, the group that includes the Komodo dragon and the great water monitors of today. In this reading, mosasaurs are varanoid lizards, close cousins of those big, active, sharp-clawed predators, and you can feel the family resemblance in the long skull and powerful build. Another line of evidence points somewhere else entirely, toward the snakes. The skulls and jaws of mosasaurs share features with snakes that are hard to dismiss, and some analyses place the mosasaurs as the sister group to serpents, or near the branching point where snakes and monitor lizards divide. Cladistic studies, the formal method of sorting these relationships by shared traits, have come down on both sides. So the truthful thing to say, the thing a careful voice should say, is that we do not yet know. The mosasaurs sit near a fork in the reptile family tree, and reasonable scientists still disagree about which branch holds them, or whether they belong closest to the fork itself. Monitor lizards, snakes, or a lineage near both. When you next picture that giant in the water, you might hold all three possibilities in mind at once, the way you would hold a family resemblance you cannot quite place. There is something of the monitor in the head, there is something of the snake in the jaw, and there is something entirely their own in the paddle-limbed, tail-driven body that neither living group can match. Hold that thought, and let me ask one small thing of you before we go deeper, because you are here and awake enough to read it. If this slow walk through deep time is the kind of thing that helps you rest, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let the shore fade behind us, and we will keep following the bones out into the water. Because the limbs were only the beginning of the changes, and the shore lizards were carrying more than paddles into the sea. They were carrying a way of breeding that would, in time, cut the last cord tying them to land. Most lizards lay eggs. An egg needs a place to be laid, and for a shore animal that place is dry ground above the tide line, a scrape in warm sand, a hollow under a root. As long as an animal must lay eggs on land, it can never fully leave the land no matter how well it swims. The egg is the leash. The mosasaur lineage cut that leash, and we can see roughly when, because the evidence sits in the rock. Among the animals close to the base of this group is one called Cretaceous, an Agialosaur-grade lizard preserved with astonishing care. One specimen is a female that died while carrying young, and inside her body, in the back 2/3 of her trunk, lie at least 4 advanced embryos. Not eggs waiting to be laid, developing young carried within the mother, close to the moment of birth. And the way they are arranged tells a quiet, specific story. They appear to be positioned to be born tail first. Tail first is not an accident. It is the same orientation used by whales and dolphins today, by the sea cows we call sirenians, by air-breathing animals that give birth in the water. A young animal born head first into the sea risks drawing its first breath before it reaches the surface, risks drowning in the moment it is meant to begin. Born tail first, the head comes last, and the newborn can rise to the air in a single unbroken movement. That these ancient marine lizards were already arranging their young this way tells us that live birth, viviparity, evolved in this lineage before its members became fully creatures of the open sea. Sit with what that means. It means that by the time the true mosasaurs took to the deep water, they no longer needed the shore for anything at all. They did not haul out to lay eggs. They gave birth where they lived, in the water, and their newborn swam from the first minute of life. The leash was gone. The land was behind them for good. Much later, in the open ocean chalk of Kansas, paleontologists would find the tiny bones of newborn mosasaurs far from any coast, so small and so delicate that when they first turned up in the late 1800s, they were mistaken for the bones of birds. Only later were they recognized for what they were: baby sea lizards born out at sea hundreds of miles from the nearest beach. The freedom those newborns represent began here, at the base of the family, in a pregnant shore lizard turned to stone with her young still inside her. There is a rhythm to this whole transformation that is worth naming plainly, because it runs against the way we usually imagine such things. We tend to picture evolution as a straight march toward the sea, purposeful, aimed. It was nothing of the kind. It was a drift, a lean, an accumulation of small advantages in animals that were only ever trying to live one more day. The Agialosaur on its warm shore was not trying to become Mosasaurus. It had no more idea of its descendants than the rock has of the quarry. It was simply a small predator, making its living at the edge of 2 worlds, and the edge, over time, moved. The shallows became home. The paddles took shape. The young came out alive into the water, and a lineage that had once needed dry land for everything came to need it for nothing. You can feel the scale of the change if you set the 2 animals side by side in your mind. At one end, the Agialosaur, a slim, 4-legged lizard the length of a walking stick, slipping off a stone into knee-deep water, still tethered to the land by its eggs and its legs, and its need to warm itself in the sun. At the other end, tens of millions of years later, the giant of the Niobrara, 30 feet and more, paddle-limbed and tail-driven, born at sea, dying at sea, dark as the depths above and pale as the surface below, a predator that ruled the warmest water it could find and answered to nothing in it. The same thread runs through both. One is only the other, unspooled across deep time, and the water they moved into was not the open blue ocean you might imagine. Through much of the late Cretaceous, The seas the mosasaurs came to rule were shallow and warm and strange. Epicontinental seas, sheets of salt water spread across the low middles of continents. In the place we now call North America, one such sea split the whole landmass in two, running from the Arctic down to the Gulf of Mexico, a drowned continental interior more than a true ocean. In its deepest central reaches it may have gone down some 2,500 feet, but much of it was far shallower, sunlit, and teeming. Warm as today's Gulf of Mexico in places, slightly less salty than a normal sea, a world of light in the upper water and cold, still, oxygen-starved darkness below. Into that light the descendants of the shore lizards spread and grew and multiplied into many kinds, and everything they became, every tooth and paddle and dark-backed body, traced back to the small animal on the beach that had chosen, without choosing, to stay a little longer in the water each day. Now let the whole scene draw back and grow quiet. The warm shore where it began has long since drowned or risen or worn away. The agialosaurs are gone, and the giants they gave rise to are gone with them, and the sea itself has emptied and dried and turned to stone. What remained of these animals sank in the end into the fine pale mud of the seafloor, the slow rain of tiny shells that built the chalk. Layer settled on layer, the mud hardened, continents shifted and seas retreated, and the buried bones lay in the dark of the rock, patient, unhurried, waiting through more millions of years than the mind can hold, for a light that would not reach them for a very long time. The afternoon light comes down through the seaway in long tilted columns, and you follow one of them with your eye until it fails. Near the surface the water is warm, close to the temperature of a summer sea in the Gulf of Mexico, mild and slightly less salty than a true ocean. Below that warmth the light thins with every foot, and far down where the coccolith mud is always settling, the water lies cold and still, and starved of oxygen. Between those two worlds, in the bright upper story where the fish are, one animal is cruising. She is a Mosasaurus, close to 40 feet long, and she has all afternoon. Watch the way she moves. The tail does most of the work, a broad, two-lobed fin driven by muscle that runs the length of her body like a single braided rope. Each stroke sculls sideways, slow as a pendulum in an old clock, and between strokes she glides. There is no hurry in her. A creature this size, weighing something on the order of 20,000 pounds or more, does not chase for the pleasure of chasing. She saves herself. The paddle limbs, 4 of them, ride flat against her sides and barely stir, tucked in like folded oars. From directly above, if you could hang in the water and look straight down her back, she would be almost impossible to hold in your gaze. Her upper body is dark, a deep grey shading to near black, and against the shadowed water below her, that darkness simply dissolves. This is countershading, the same trick the leatherback turtle wears today. Her back matches the depths. Her belly, pale and dull, matches the bright ceiling of the surface. Seen from beneath, with the sky pouring light down past her, she thins into the glare and vanishes. She carries her own camouflage on her skin, painted in 2 halves, and she wears it in both directions at once. Feel, for a moment, how large she is by the shadow she throws. When she passes over the pale seabed far below, her shape slides across the mud broad as the door of a barn swung open. Small things on the bottom, if anything down there in that low oxygen dark were awake to notice, would feel the light dim and return as she rode overhead. But she is not hunting the bottom. Her business is here, in the sunlit water where prey gathers, and the seabed is only a floor she rarely touches. Her senses are tuned to this middle water. Her eyes sit high on a long skull, taking in the shifting light and the flick of movement against it. Some of her smaller cousins, like a Japanese mosasaur no longer than a canoe, evolved forward-facing eyes with an unusually wide overlap for judging distance in dim light. She's built more simply than that, but she does not need much. In water this clear near the surface, a school of fish betrays itself in 100 small ways. A wall of silver bodies turning together, a change in the texture of the light, the faint pressure of many tails beating at once, carried to her through the water like a rumour. She's warm inside. That is one of the quieter marvels of her. Chemistry locked into the bone of mosasaurs suggests body temperatures somewhere around 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, held steady regardless of how cold the surrounding sea might turn. She does not go sluggish when she drops into cooler water, the way a truly cold-blooded reptile would. Her warmth is her own, generated and kept, and it lets her cruise for hours and strike without a long wind-up. The engine idles hot even at rest. For now she simply travels. The seaway around her is not silent, and it is not empty. Coiled ammonites drift at the edge of her vision, and the long straight cones of baculites hang in the water like sticks that forgot to sink. Somewhere off to one side a diving seabird, a flightless swimmer built for chasing fish, punches down from the surface in a stream of bubbles and pulls itself deeper with its feet. A shark crosses below her and thinks better of whatever it was considering. The water carries all of this to her as sound and pressure, a low, continuous murmur of other lives, none of it worth turning for. Then something is worth turning for. Ahead, and a little below, a loose school of fish has bunched. She does not lunge, she adjusts. One long tail stroke, deeper than the last, tips her nose down a few degrees, and she begins to close the distance without seeming to try. This is the part that would surprise you if you expected a monster. There is no thrashing, no burst of foam. There is only a very large animal becoming very slightly faster, her dark back holding her hidden from the fish that might glance upward toward the light. She comes up the blind lane beneath them, the pale of her belly lost in the glare, a shape they cannot resolve until it's far too near. Her jaw is a machine built for exactly this. Along the length of her lower jaw sits a second hinge, partway back, a flexible joint that lets each side of the jaw bow outward. Living monitor lizards and snakes have their own versions of it. It means her gape can open wider and wrap around prey larger than a stiff jaw could ever manage. And on the roof of her mouth, set back toward the throat, runs a second row of teeth on pterygoid bones, curved and backward-leaning, made not for cutting, but for gripping. Once something is inside that mouth, those teeth walk it inward. Escape runs the wrong way against them. The strike, when it comes, is almost gentle to watch because it is so quick and so brief. There is a surge, a single hard drive of the tail, and the wide jaws open and close. One fish chosen out of many is simply gone inside her. The rest of the school detonates outward in every direction. A silver flowering of panic, and the water fills with the fine flash of scattering bodies. She does not pursue the scatter. That would cost more than it would earn. She has what she came up for, and she holds it, the throat teeth already drawing it down and back, and she lets her own momentum carry her forward through the drifting cloud of the ones that got away. It is an unhurried meal for a body this size. A single fish is a small thing against 20,000 pounds. But she is not feeding to fullness in one strike. She is grazing the upper water across a long afternoon, taking what the light and the current bring her, spending as little as she can for each mouthful. The intramandibular joint and the palate teeth are extravagant tools for a fish this modest, and on another day she might turn them on something far larger, a smaller mosasaur, a thick-shelled ammonite, a seabird pulled down mid-dive. Today the sea has offered fish, and fish is enough. The swallow finishes. She levels off. And now the oldest fact about her asserts itself quietly, the one thing that never lets her forget the surface. She is a reptile, and she breathes air. For all that her ancestors abandoned the shore, for all that she gives birth in open water, and may never touch land in her life, her lungs still want the sky. Somewhere in the last stretch of minutes the need has been building, unhurried but certain, and now she answers it. She begins to rise. It is the slowest movement of the whole afternoon. She angles her long body upward and lets a few easy tail strokes lift her through the tilted columns of light. The water brightens around her by degrees. The murmur of the deeper sea falls away beneath her. As she climbs, the light that was thin and blue down where she struck becomes green, then gold, then a shivering silver ceiling close overhead, the underside of the surface breaking the sun into 1,000 moving coins. Her pale belly, which hid her from below, now shows plainly as she turns broadside to the light, and for a moment she's not hidden at all, only enormous and calm and climbing. Her back breaks the surface first, a long dark island rising where, a moment ago, there was only water, then the top of her skull, then the nostrils set high on it. She exhales, and the warm air she has carried since her last breath goes out of her in a low rush, and hangs as mist above the sea. She draws the new breath in, one slow filling of those long lungs, and the sound of it is small against the size of her, a single soft note in a wide and rolling sea. Around her the surface stretches away flat and bright to a horizon with no land on it, only water and light and the slow heave of an inland ocean that covers half a continent. She does not linger at the top. One breath is what she came up for, the way one fish was what she went down for, and she spends nothing she does not have to. She rolls forward, her dark back sliding under again, and the mist she breathed out thins and is gone. The wake of her turning body spreads outward in long, low rings, and those two flatten and fade until the surface forgets her entirely. Below, the light goes back to its slow tilting. The mud goes back to its endless settling. And she goes back to cruising the warm upper water, patient and unhurried, an animal with all the afternoon it will ever need, at the very top of the last great sea. This is the animal, as near as bone and chemistry and careful study can bring her back. But long before anyone gave this animal a name, its bones lay folded into a wall of pale stone, and the people who first struck them had no word for what they were. But long before anyone gave this animal a name, its bones lay folded into a wall of pale stone, and the people who first struck them had no word for what they were. But long before anyone gave this animal a name, its bones lay folded into a wall of pale stone, and the people who first struck them had no word for what they were. The stone was chalk, soft and yellow-white, the colour of old candle wax. It rose in a low hill above the river Meuse, near the town of Maastricht, in what is now the southern Netherlands. People there called the hill Mount St. Peter. For centuries workers had cut into it for building stone, following the seams underground with picks and lamps until the quarry became a maze of galleries, cool and quiet and dry. The rock came away in soft blocks. It was easy to shape, easy to carry, and it held the shapes of dead things the way soft clay holds a fingerprint. Shells, sea urchins, the coiled ghosts of animals no one living had ever seen swim. In the year 1764, in one of those underground galleries, workers cutting stone struck bone. It was a partial skull, lodged in the chalk like a knot buried in the grain of a plank. They noticed it, in the way you notice a stone in a field, and then they moved on. No one wrote much down. No one understood what they were looking at. The find drifted quietly into the background of a local curiosity. One more strange shape among the shells and the urchins, and for a while the pale hill kept its secret a little longer. Try for a moment to stand where they stood. The air underground is still and even, neither cold nor warm, and it smells faintly of dust and lamp smoke. Above you, hundreds of feet of chalk press down in silence. Every surface is the same soft, chalky white, so that shadows seem to soak into the walls rather than fall across them. And all around you, sealed in the rock, are the remains of a sea, not a lake, not a river, a warm, shallow sea that once covered this whole country, and much of Europe besides, tens of millions of years before the first human ever drew breath. That is the strange thing to hold on to here, and it is worth holding on to slowly, The chalk itself is a kind of fossil. It is made almost entirely of the microscopic armour of algae, tiny plates of calcite that drifted down through warm water like an endless silent snow, settling on a dark seafloor grain by grain over unimaginable stretches of time. Every block those quarry workers lifted onto their shoulders was compressed marine snow, the sediment of a vanished ocean, packed until it turned to stone. And somewhere in that ocean, while the snow fell, a giant had died and sunk into the mud, and the mud had closed over it, and the snow had kept falling, and the sea had eventually withdrawn, and a hill had risen, and men with lamps had come tunnelling in. All of that had to happen in that order before anyone could strike bone in the dark. The second discovery mattered more, and it is the one that made this hill famous. Sometime between 1770 and 1774, in the same network of underground galleries, quarrymen uncovered a second skull, and this one was far more complete. It was enormous. From the tip of the snout to the back of the jaw, it measured close to 5 feet, longer than a tall man is wide across his outstretched arms. A single head as long as a grown person is from shoulder to knee, and then some. Set into the long jaws was a row of cone-shaped teeth, curved and smooth and sharp, the teeth of something built to seize and hold. No animal anyone knew of, alive in any sea or river or menagerie in Europe, had a head like this. Word of it spread. A local surgeon and fossil collector named Johann Leonard Hoffmann took an intense interest in the specimen and began writing letters about it, corresponding with leading naturalists across the continent. In an age before photographs, this is how a fossil travelled. It travelled as description, as careful drawings, as measurements copied out in ink and carried by post from one curious mind to the next. Through Hoffmann's letters, the great skull from the chalk of Maastricht became known far beyond the quarry, and people began to speak of it with a phrase that stuck. The great animal of Maastricht, not a fish, not a crocodile, not anything with a settled name, a great animal, unclassified, waiting. You should sit with how unsettling that phrase was, because we have lost the ability to feel it. We grow up knowing that the world is old, that seas have come and gone, that whole kinds of creatures have vanished from the earth. The people passing Hoffmann's letters back and forth knew none of that as settled fact. Many of them believed the living world was essentially fixed, that every creature made was a creature still present somewhere, uncounted but not lost. A skull like this put a hard question in front of them. If this animal was real, and clearly it was real, you could hold its teeth in your hand, then where was it now? Why did no ship ever meet it, no net ever catch it, no coast ever wash it ashore? Where does a thing that large go to disappear? Before those questions could be answered, the skull itself went on a journey of its own. In 1794, French revolutionary armies advanced on Maastricht and laid siege to the town. The great skull had by then become valuable enough that it was hidden away for safekeeping. It did not stay hidden. When the French forces took the town, the fossil was found and carried off to Paris as a prize of war, packed out of the chalk country and delivered into the collections of the capital. And it was there, in Paris, in the hands of one of the sharpest minds of the age, that the great animal of Maastricht finally began to give up its meaning. Before we follow it into that Paris collection, let me say one quiet thing, and then we will go back to the bones. If these long, slow walks through deep time help you unwind at the end of the day, you can follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. That is all. Now settle back in, and let us return to the skull on its table in Paris, and to the man who was about to read it. The man was Georges Cuvier, and he was, at that moment, assembling one of the most consequential ideas in the history of the natural world. Cuvier was a comparative anatomist. His particular genius lay in bones. Give him a jaw, a limb, a fragment of a skull, and he could reason his way toward the whole animal, because he understood how the parts of a body constrain one another. how a certain kind of tooth implies a certain kind of jaw, and a certain kind of jaw a certain kind of life. He looked at animals the way a locksmith looks at a key, reading the shape for the lock it was cut to open. For years, Cuvier had been building a careful, almost forensic case for an idea that many of his contemporaries resisted. The idea was that extinction is real, that there had once lived creatures that live no longer, not hidden in some unexplored forest or unsounded sea, but simply gone, erased from the roll of the living. He had already made this argument with the great fossil elephants, showing that the mammoth and the mastodon were not the same as any living elephant, that they were their own kinds, and that their kind had ended. But the great animal of Maastricht was a different order of evidence, and he knew it. Here was no near cousin of a living beast. Here was a monster. In 1808, Cuvier delivered his verdict on the skull. This was not a fish, and not a crocodile. It was a lizard, a giant marine lizard, related to the monitor lizards, the varanids, the large land reptiles that still stalk the tropics today, though this one had grown to a size no living lizard approaches and had gone to live in the open sea. And crucially, it was a lizard that no longer existed anywhere on Earth. It had lived, and it had died out, and the chalk was its tombstone. The great animal of Maastricht became, in Cuvier's hands, a cornerstone of the argument that extinction was a real and demonstrable phenomenon, something you could prove from the rock itself. Hold on to the weight of that turn, because it is the true reason this quarry matters. A skull came out of a hill in a small country, and it helped teach the world that the past is not simply the present with fewer names in it. The past is a graveyard. It is full of vanished kinds. The animals in the deep rock are not misplaced or overlooked. They are extinct, and the word extinct means gone in a way nothing can undo. Every child who has ever loved a creature that no longer walks the earth is standing, without knowing it, on ground that Cuvier helped to level, and a large share of that ground was pale chalk from the galleries beneath Mount St. Peter. Notice too what Cuvier did and did not get right, because the honest shape of this history matters more than a tidy one. He was right that the animal was a giant extinct marine lizard, right that its nearest living relatives lay among the monitor lizard kin, right that it belonged to a vanished world. He read the bones with astonishing skill and reached from a single battered skull a conclusion that has held for more than 2 centuries, but he did not in 1808 give the animal the name we use for it now. That came later, from other hands, and it came in pieces, the way most names in this science do. The naming is worth slowing down for, because it explains the words we still say. In 1822, an English geologist named William Daniel Conybeare proposed a name for the genus, for the whole kind of creature the skull represented. He built the name from the place it was found. The town of Maastricht sits on a river, the Meuse, known in Dutch and in the Old Latin as the Maas or the Mosa. Conybeare took that river and joined it to the Greek word for lizard, sauros, and made Mosasaurus, lizard of the Meuse, lizard of the Maas, a name that carries a specific bend of a specific river in a small stretch of Europe, fixed now to an animal whose remains have since been dug from nearly every continent on Earth, including the frozen rock of Antarctica. The species name took a few more years to settle, and it settled onto the man with the letters. The great skull, and the animal it stood for, came to be called Mosasaurus hoffmanni, honouring Johann Leonard Hoffmann, the surgeon whose careful correspondence had carried the specimen out into the wider world of science. That species designation was accepted as the type by 1829, through the work of the English geologist Gideon Mantell, one of the founding figures in the study of fossil reptiles. So the full name braids together a river and a man, the place where the bones lay, and the person who made sure the right people knew. There is a small, human irony folded into all of this, and it is worth noticing on a quiet night. The animal is named for a river it never saw, in a language it could not have heard, by men born tens of millions of years after the last of its kind slipped beneath the waves. It did not know it was a lizard. It did not know it lived in a sea that would one day be a hill in the Netherlands. It only lived and hunted and died and sank into the falling white snow of the seafloor, and that was the whole of its concern. The name Mosasaurus hoffmanni is a thing we made, long afterward, to hold a place for it in our minds. The animal itself needs no name. It had the sea, and what a sea it was, in the time this particular animal lived. The chalk near Maastricht belongs to the very end of the Cretaceous, to the age called the Maastrichtian, named for this same town, the final chapter before the great extinction that closed the age of dinosaurs. The sea that laid down this chalk was warm and shallow, a drowned shelf spread across the low country of Europe, bright with life near the surface and dim and quiet near the floor. The largest individuals of Mosasaurus hoffmanni, by the best supported estimates drawn from real jaws and skulls, ran somewhere between 39 and 46 feet long, roughly the length of a large city bus and then some, with the heaviest weighing on the order of 22,000 to 33,000 pounds. That is a body heavier than a bull African elephant. Moving through water it never had to leave. It did not have the sea to itself. Sharing those same warm Maastrichtian shallows was a giant sea turtle, Alapleuron hoffmanni, a pelagic wanderer with a shell somewhere between 3 and 6 feet long, gliding through the open water on long wing-like limbs. Chemical study of its bones points to a meat-eating way of life, and curiously, nearly all the fossils we find of it are adults, which hints that the young grew up somewhere else, perhaps in sheltered seagrass nurseries closer to shore. So picture the water column layered with life, ammonites turning slowly in the current in their coiled shells, fish moving in schools that caught the light, the great flat turtle sculling past, and cruising through all of it, the dark shape of the mosasaur unbothered, at the top of everything. You can feel, standing in the imagined water, how the whole ecosystem was stacked. Near the surface the sun poured down and warmed the upper column, and things fed and were fed upon in the brightness. But the sea floor, sometimes hundreds of feet below, lay in cold and gloom, poor in oxygen, where little moved but the endless soft rain of settling sediment, and the slow rot of whatever had died above and drifted down. The chalk records both worlds at once, the bright surface in the countless tiny algae whose armour made the stone, the dark floor in the still undisturbed way that stone was laid, layer on quiet layer, with nothing burrowing through to churn it. When a mosasaur died and sank, it passed out of the lit world and into that dark one, and the dark one kept it, patiently, for 66 million years, until a lamp and a pick found it in a wall. There is one more thing to understand about why the discovery unfolded as it did, and it has to do with the rock itself. Chalk is a generous keeper of bones. Because it formed from such fine, even sediment in such calm water, it can preserve fossils in exquisite condition, holding delicate structures that coarser stone would grind away. And because it is soft, it can be worked by hand, cut and shaped and tunnelled without machines. Those two facts together are why the underground galleries of Mount St. Peter kept turning up sea monsters over the years. The same quality that made the stone good for building made it a vault for the dead. Men went in looking for material to raise walls, and they came out now and then, carrying the skull of an animal that had helped drown an old idea of the world. By the time the naming was finished, by the time the words Mosasaurus and Hoffmannia had been fixed onto the great animal of Maastricht, the intellectual work the skull had done was already immense. It had helped convince thoughtful people that extinction was real. It had given a face, a very large and toothy face, to the notion that the deep past held whole kinds of life the present had lost. It had drawn the attention of the finest anatomists and geologists of its age, and it had launched what would become the long study of the mosasaurs, a lineage of sea-going lizards that we now know ruled the last great oceans of the Cretaceous for something close to 25 million years. All of that, from bones in a wall of pale stone struck by workers who had no word for what they were. But a name is only a label. Cuvier's verdict, correct as it was, told you the animal's family and its fate, extinct marine lizard, kin to the monitors, gone from the earth. It did not tell you what it was like to be that animal or to meet it. It did not describe the jaw that could swallow prey most predators could only tear, or the eyes set in that long skull, or the limbs that had traded feet for something else, or the tail that drove all those tons through warm water. The skull on the table in Paris was a door, and behind the door was a living creature, dark-backed and pale-bellied, patient and enormous, gliding through the drowned country of the Cretaceous. The first sign of it came in 1764, and almost no one noticed. Quarrymen were cutting limestone in an underground gallery beneath Mount St. Peter, the long chalk hill that rises just south of Maastricht. They worked in tunnels bored straight into the rock, hauling out blocks pale as bone. Somewhere in that pale stone a partial skull came loose. It was odd enough to keep, odd enough to set aside. Then it slipped out of the record, the way a small thing does, and the galleries closed back into their long quiet. For a while the great animal simply waited, unremarked, in the dark. 10 years passed. Underground the quarry kept eating into the hill, gallery by gallery, room by cut stone room. Then, sometime between 1770 and 1774, a second skull came out of the chalk, and this one was different. It was nearly whole. Long jaws set with cone-shaped teeth, locked inside a slab that the workers had to free in careful pieces. This time the find did not vanish. This time someone was paying attention, someone who understood, even without a name for it, that this was no ordinary lump of bone, that someone was Johann Leonard Hoffmann, a surgeon in Maastricht who collected fossils in his spare hours. He gathered the fragments, had them cleaned and steadied, and then he did the thing that turned a curiosity into a landmark. He began to write letters. He wrote to naturalists across Europe, sending careful descriptions of the jaws and drawings where he could manage them. Word moved the slow way then, by post and by rumour, carried from one curious mind to the next across months and borders. The specimen picked up a name that travelled with it. People began to call it the great animal of Maastricht, as though the hill had produced a single monster and this was its head. You can feel in that phrase how little anyone understood. It was clearly an animal. It was clearly dead a very long time, and it was clearly nothing you could point to in any living river or sea. Some who studied the drawing said crocodile, some said whale. The teeth insisted only that something toothed and enormous had once swum, where the chalk now lay dry and quarried. There was no category ready for it. So it sat in the correspondence of Europe as a question with jaws, discussed in a dozen studies by men who had never seen it and never would. That is the strange power of a good fossil. It becomes a rumour you can measure, a thing argued over at a distance, its shape passing from letter to letter, while the object itself stays fixed in one small town, half buried still in the stone it came from. A quarrel over who owned it followed, as quarrels do around anything suddenly worth wanting. The precise details have blurred with retelling, and some of what gets repeated now is closer to legend than to anything you could call documented. What is clear is that the skull became property, contested and valuable, the kind of possession that people lock away rather than lend. By the time the wider world truly wanted to see it, the great animal of Maastricht had been tucked out of easy reach, hidden by an owner who understood what he was holding. By 1794, the question had a new kind of danger gathered around it. The French Revolution had spilled outward into war, and revolutionary armies were pushing north through the Low Countries. That autumn they came to Maastricht and laid siege to it. Guns were set on the heights above the river, and the same chalk hill that had given up the skull now shook under bombardment. Somewhere inside the walls the fossil sat in its hiding place out of sight, while the town endured the siege around it. The story that survives says the French knew what they were after. When the town fell, and it did fall, the hidden skull was part of what the occupiers meant to collect. Armies, after all, take more than territory. They take treasure, and to the right eyes a fossil skull was treasure of an unusual and permanent kind. The search for it has thinned into anecdote over the centuries, and here again you should hold the details loosely because much of the tale has been polished by the telling. But the ending is not in doubt. The skull was found. It was crated, and it went to Paris as a prize of war. The crate was heavier than a man could lift alone. Chalk is not light, and the block that cradled those jaws carried the weight of stone as well as bone. Picture the labour of it, the fossil bedded and braced, then lifted by several men at once, the whole weight of the great animal of Maastricht resting on a few pairs of shoulders as it left the hill for good. It rode south by cart and by water, over roads churned by an army on the move, out of the town that had made it famous and into the capital of the revolution. So the skull became a traveller. It had waited in the rock for tens of millions of years, and now, in the span of a single war, it was passed hand to hand like the rumour it had already become. From the dark gallery to the surgeon's table, from a private hiding place to a soldier's crate, from a besieged town to a museum in a foreign city. Each stage moved the object a little further from the seabed that made it, and a little closer to the moment when someone would finally understand what they were looking at. In Paris, the skull came to rest in the collections of the Young Republic's Museum of Natural History, and there, in its own time, it met the mind that would give it a place in the order of things. Georges Cuvier was building a new kind of science, one that read old bones the way you might read handwriting, comparing them limb for limb against the living. He had already begun to argue something that unsettled his age. He believed that entire kinds of animals had once existed and were now simply gone, vanished from the earth, their forms preserved only in stone. The Maastricht skull became one of his cornerstones. Studying its proportions, its teeth, the architecture of those long jaws, Cuvier concluded in 1808 that this was no crocodile and no whale. It was a giant lizard, an enormous marine reptile related to the monitor lizards that still walk the earth, and it was extinct. Nothing like it swam in any ocean now. Here was a creature that had lived and ruled and ended, its whole kind erased, and the proof of it lay in a block of chalk carried out of a conquered town. That conclusion did more than name an animal. It helped settle one of the great questions of the age, the question of whether extinction was real at all. For a long time, people had resisted the idea that a species could simply cease to be. The great animal of Maastricht, mute and enormous on its museum table, made the argument in a way words alone could not. You could stand before it and see a thing that no longer existed anywhere. The skull that quarrymen had nearly overlooked became evidence that deep time swallows whole lineages and does not give them back. The name we use came later, and it too traces back to that hill and that river. In 1822, the English naturalist William Daniel Conybeare proposed calling the creature Mosasaurus, the lizard of the Meuse, after the river the Dutch call the Maas that runs past Maastricht. A few years on, by 1829, the species name Hoffmanni came into accepted use, honouring the surgeon whose patient letters had carried the animal into the world of science. The man who first understood the skull's worth was fixed at last into its formal name, so the object had arrived, found by lamplight, argued over in letters, hidden from an army, hauled south under guard, and finally read by a man who could tell the world what it meant. The great animal of Maastricht had become the type specimen, the reference against which every later find would be measured, the first mosasaur ever brought into human knowledge. Its journey from the dark gallery to the museum floor is one of the oldest detective stories in all of paleontology, and it began, remember, with a partial skull that almost no one thought to keep. But a name and a journey only tell you how the animal came to be known. They do not tell you what it was, standing in the water, alive. The skull that unsettled Cuvier, the skull that helped prove extinction, still had to answer for its own strange shape. Those jaws were built a particular way, for a particular kind of life, and the eyes and the limbs told their own story of an animal wholly at home in the sea. To understand why that skull unsettled the men who studied it, you have to look closely at the animal itself, at the jaws and the eyes and the limbs that made it what it was. To understand why that skull unsettled the men who studied it, you have to look closely at the animal itself, at the jaws and the eyes and the limbs that made it what it was. To understand why that skull unsettled the men who studied it, you have to look closely at the animal itself, at the jaws and the eyes and the limbs that made it what it was. Begin with the mouth, because the mouth is where the strangeness starts. Picture a lower jaw longer than your whole arm, lined with teeth shaped like blunt cones of enamel. Now imagine that jaw is not one rigid bar of bone. Partway along its length, between the front teeth and the joint at the back, there is a second hinge. If you have ever wondered how a creature at sea swallows something almost as wide as its own head, stay with me a moment, because the answer is folded into that single bone. It is worth slowing down for. The hinge has a name. Paleontologists call it the intramandibular joint, a flexible seam running partway down the lower jaw, set apart from the usual joint where the jaw meets the skull. Most animals you know, including you, carry only one working joint on each side of the lower jaw, the one near your ears that lets you chew. Run a fingertip along your own jawline now and feel how it holds firm, a single unbroken curve of bone. A mosasaur did not work that way. Its jaw could bend in the middle. That bending was not a flaw, it was a gate. When the animal seized a fish or a squid, the front of the jaw could flex slightly outward and downward, opening the throat wider than a fixed jaw ever could. Think of it less as a nutcracker, and more as a pair of doors set one behind the other, an outer gate at the tip of the snout and an inner gate deeper in the mouth. Prey past the first, and met the second. Once inside, there was very little room to turn around. This is not a guess pulled from thin air. The same kind of loose lower jaw survives today in the animal scientists believe are the mosasaurs' close kin. Monitor lizards have a version of it. Snakes have a more extreme version still, their jaws so loosely strung that they can walk a meal down the throat in slow, deliberate stages. When you watch a large snake swallow something round and stubborn, you are watching a distant echo of what these sea lizards did in Cretaceous water more than 66 million years ago. The exact family tree is still argued over, whether mosasaurs sit closer to snakes or to monitor lizards, and honest researchers will tell you that debate is not settled. But the flexible jaw is a thread that runs through all of them. Now look up into the roof of the mouth, because there is a second surprise there. Along the palate on a pair of bones called the pterygoids sat another row of teeth. Not the big cones along the jaw rim, but a smaller backward-leaning set anchored to the roof of the mouth itself. Press your tongue to the ridged roof of your own mouth, and picture that ridge studded with teeth, and you have the shape of it. These pterygoid teeth did not do the killing. They did something quieter, and, for the prey, far worse. They gripped. As a swallowed fish slid backward, those palate teeth caught it, and held, all of them angled inward toward the throat. A struggling animal that tried to wriggle forward and out found itself hauled the other way, deeper in, tooth row by tooth row. It was a ratchet made of enamel, letting food travel one direction only. This too is a trait mosasaurs shared with modern snakes and certain lizards, an old solution to an old problem, how to keep a slippery meal from escaping once it is already in your mouth. There was the first gate, the outer teeth. There was the second gate, the flexing jaw. And there was the ratchet on the ceiling drawing everything down, a fish that felt the first bite had almost no path back to the open sea. Combine those parts and you begin to understand what these animals could eat. A mosasaur was not restricted to prey it could bite in half. It could take large things whole. Some of the biggest, The type species Mosasaurus hoffmanii reached lengths estimated between 39 and 46 feet, longer than a school bus, and the heaviest individuals may have weighed somewhere around 22,000 to 33,000 pounds. A mouth on an animal that size, fitted with a jaw that could flex and a palate that could grip, was a trap with very few exits. You will hear even larger figures quoted, jaw fragments extrapolated to 50 or 60 feet. But many paleontologists consider those upper numbers overreaches, and it is more honest to hold the well-supported range and call the rest speculation. So much for the front of the animal. Now let your attention drift backward, down the long body to the parts that moved it through water, because here the science has changed dramatically within living memory, and the change is worth telling slowly. For most of the time, humans have known mosasaurs existed. Roughly 200 years, artists drew them wrong. Not wildly wrong, but wrong in a specific telling way. They gave them long, tapering tails, straight and simple like an eel's, or like a crocodile's, a muscular rope that thinned to a point. It seemed reasonable. The bones of the tail did narrow toward the tip, so a narrowing tail is what people drew. For 2 centuries the mosasaur swam through paintings and museum halls, trailing that smooth eel tail behind it. Then, in a specimen from Jordan described in 2013, the real shape came out of the rock. This fossil was extraordinary because it preserved more than bone. It preserved soft tissue, the faint carbon ghost of skin and fin printed into the stone around the skeleton. And the tail told a different story. Near its end, the vertebra bent sharply downward, and above that downward kink spread a large fleshy lobe. The tail was not a simple point at all. It was 2-lobed, a fin shaped much like a shark's, with a lower bony lobe and an upper fleshy one. Scientists call that shape hypercircle and bilobed, and its discovery, published in Nature Communications, quietly rewrote every earlier drawing. Sit with what that means. A shark-like tail is not a decoration. It is a propulsion system built for driving a heavy body forward with strong, efficient strokes. The old eel-tailed mosasaur was imagined as a slow, snaking swimmer, undulating its whole length like a sea snake. The new mosasaur, with its crescent fin, was something closer to a large shark or a tuna in the way it moved water, a body that could hold a steady cruise and then surge. When you next picture one of these animals, delete the eel and paint in the fin. That is the more accurate creature, and it took 200 years and one beautifully preserved slab to see it. That said, keep the picture honest. When paleontologists compare the cruising ability of great Mesozoic sea reptiles, mosasaurs do not come out on top. The most efficient long-distance swimmers were the ichthyosaurs, those dolphin-shaped reptiles built entirely for open water. Plesiosaurs, with their 4 wing-like flippers, rank next. Mosasaurs fall below both for sustained, patient cruising. What they had instead was burst. The shark tail gave them a hard, sudden acceleration, the kind an ambush predator uses to close the last stretch of water before a strike. Not a marathon swimmer, a sprinter that could wait. Before we go further into the body, let me say one thing to you directly, softly, because this is roughly the middle of our slow walk through this animal, and it is the only time I will ask. If these long, quiet journeys through deep time are the kind of thing that helps you drift off, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. That is all. Settle back in. We were at the limbs, because the tail was not the only thing that moved the animal. Look at the paddles. Where its shore-dwelling ancestors once had ordinary walking legs, ankles, wrists, clawed toes, the mosasaur had flippers. The bones of the hand and foot were shortened and flattened and webbed over into broad paddles, 4 of them, 2 forward and 2 behind. Spread your own hand flat and imagine the fingers fused under a mitten of skin, and you have the general idea, a limb turned from a walking tool into a steering blade. These paddles did not power the animal the way the tail did. They trimmed and turned it. They were rudders and dive planes, tilting the great body up toward the sunlit surface or down into the dark. There is a newer idea about the front paddles, and it deserves a careful telling because it is still a hypothesis, not a settled fact. In 2019, a biomechanical study pointed out something odd about the mosasaur shoulder. The pectoral girdle, the arc of bone that anchored the front flippers, was unusually large and set unusually low on the body. A big, low shoulder girdle is a place to attach big muscles. The study proposed that mosasaurs may have used those forelimbs not just for steering, but for a kind of powered pull, a breaststroke, hauling water with the front paddles in short bursts to add to the drive of the tail. Picture the animal gathering itself and sweeping both front flippers back in a single strong stroke, the way a swimmer pulls, a surge stacked on top of the tail surge. It is a compelling picture. It is also newer than the traditional view of a purely tail-driven swimmer, and researchers are still weighing one against the other. Hold it as a possibility, not a certainty. So here is the moving animal, as far as bone and preserved tissue let us reconstruct it. A long, deep-bodied lizard with a shark's tail at the back, 4 steering paddles along the sides, and a low muscular shoulder that may have added a rowing pull to its stroke. Now we come to the surface of it, the skin, and to a question that for most of paleontology seemed unanswerable. What colour was it? For nearly all of the history of this science, colour was thought to be lost forever, rotted away with the flesh, leaving only the impossible-to-know surface of a vanished animal. Artists simply guessed. They painted mosasaurs green or grey or striped according to taste. But in 2014 came a study that reached past the guessing. Researchers examined fossilized mosasaur skin under high magnification and found it dense with melanosomes, the tiny structures that carry pigment. Melanosomes survive in the rock when almost everything else is gone, and their shape and density carry a signal about the original colour. The mosasaur skin was packed with them. That density pointed to a dark animal. Not green, not pale, but very dark, likely somewhere from deep grey to near black across the back. And the pattern was not uniform. The back carried more pigment than the belly. The upper surface was dark, the underside paler. This arrangement has a name in the modern ocean, countershading, and you can see it today on a leatherback sea turtle, that great dark diver, whose back is nearly black and whose underside is lighter. The same paint scheme, worn by an animal 70 million years apart. Countershading is not for show. It is camouflage tuned to the physics of water and light. Consider how the mosasaur looked from below, a predator or a rival gazing up. Against the bright sunlit ceiling of the sea, the animal's pale belly blurred into the glare and all but vanished. Now consider the view from above, looking down. Against the cold, dark water of the depths, the animal's black back merged into the gloom and disappeared just as completely. From either angle the shape dissolved. A 30-foot predator became difficult to see from above and from below at once, hidden not by hiding, but by matching the light in both directions. When you next stand at the edge of deep water and notice how the surface turns to hammered silver overhead and to blackness below, you are looking at the two backgrounds that painted this animal, and the sea it lived in gives that camouflage its full meaning. The water where many of these fossils formed was mild, subtropical, roughly as warm as today's Gulf of Mexico, and above it the sun reached well down into the upper water. But near the bottom, hundreds of feet down in the deeper basins, the water lay cold and starved of oxygen, stirred by only the weakest of currents. Fine white mud drifted down through it constantly, the crushed shells of countless microscopic algae, settling like a slow, endless snow. That pale snow built the chalk beds that hold these bones today. A dark, counter-shaded animal moving between the bright ceiling and the black floor of such a sea was nearly invisible in the one water that mattered, the water where it hunted. Which brings us finally to the eyes, and to how the animal found its prey in the first place. Most lizards do not see the world the way you do. Their eyes sit on the sides of the head, each one watching its own separate half of the world, giving a wide field of view but very little overlap between the two. There is a cost to that arrangement. Without much overlap, there is little true depth perception, little of the layered three-dimensional sight you get from two eyes aimed at the same thing. For a typical squamate, the lizard and snake group, the region where both eyes see the same scene at once might span only 10 to 20 degrees, enough to notice movement. Not much for judging exact distance. Some mosasaurs broke that pattern. A small Japanese species called Phosphorosaurus pompiteligans, described in 2015, had eyes that faced more forward than most, and when researchers measured the overlap, they estimated a binocular field of roughly 35 degrees. That is wide for a lizard, well beyond the usual 10 to 20. Two eyes aimed forward, their views overlapping, the way a cat's do, or an owl's, or yours. That overlap builds depth. It lets an animal judge, with precision, exactly how far away a target sits, exactly when to strike. Phosphorosaurus was not a giant. It measured only about 10 feet, small among mosasaurs, and its forward eyes suit that size. The researchers who described it proposed that this was a low-light hunter, an animal working the dim water at dusk or in the depths, perhaps pursuing prey that glowed faintly with its own light. In dim water, sharp depth perception matters enormously. A predator that can pinpoint the distance to a faint moving glow has a real advantage over one that only sees a smear of light somewhere ahead. So, here was a mosasaur with eyes built not for the bright surface but for the darker, quieter layers, a creature that read the gloom. Not every mosasaur saw this way. The group was varied, and different species carried different eyes for different lives, some scanning wide for movement, some, like this one, aimed forward for depth. But the presence of true binocular vision in even one branch tells you these animals were not simple. They were sensory specialists tuned to the exact water they hunted. There is one more thread worth pulling before we leave the body, and it lives inside the bones rather than on the surface. When researchers measured the chemistry locked in mosasaur bone, the oxygen isotopes, they found something unexpected. The signal suggested elevated body temperatures, somewhere around 95 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and, tellingly, temperatures that did not simply track the water the animal swam in. A cold-blooded creature's body matches its surroundings. These signals did not. They pointed toward an animal that held its own warmth, at least partly, a warm-blooded or nearly warm-blooded sea lizard. Hold this one gently, because it is inferred, not observed. No one has taken a mosasaur's temperature. The conclusion is read from the chemistry of fossil bone, and the degree of that inner warmth, and exactly how the animal managed it, remain live questions in the science. But if it holds, it reshapes the whole picture. A warm-bodied mosasaur could stay active in the cold, oxygen-poor depths where a cold-blooded reptile would slow and stiffen. It could hunt the dark layers its dark skin was painted for, its forward eyes reading the gloom, its inner heat keeping its muscles quick where the water ran cold. The parts begin to fit together into one animal built for one life. Set them all side by side now, the whole assembled creature. A lower jaw hinged in the middle, opening a second gate into the throat. A palate studded with backward-raked teeth that hauled prey down and would not let it climb back out. A body long and deep carried on 4 steering paddles and driven by a crescent tail like a shark's, with a heavy low shoulder that may have added a rowing pull. A skin so dark it nearly vanished against the depths, paler beneath so it vanished against the light. Eyes, in some, aimed forward for depth in dim water, and quite possibly a warmth held inside the bones that let all of it work in the cold. None of these features stands alone. Each one answers a problem of living and hunting in open water, and together they describe an animal that had left the land behind so completely that only the loose lizard jaw still whispered where it came from. That is the machine. Bone and tooth and paddle and fin, dark skin and forward eyes, a body reworked over millions of years from a small shore-crawling lizard into a giant that owned the water column from the bright surface to the black floor. But a machine is only half the story. A predator this large, this specialized, this hungry did not exist in a vacuum. It needed room, it needed depth and warmth, and an ocean stocked with enough prey to feed tons of appetite day after day across a lifetime spent entirely at sea. Think for a moment about how any of this is known, because none of it was ever watched. No one stood in the Cretaceous sea and measured a living mosasaur. Everything you have been told about the shape of the tail, the colour of the skin, the warmth of the blood, was pulled back out of stone slowly by people reading marks that the animal never meant to leave, and for a long stretch of that reading the picture was simply wrong. Start with the tail, because the tail fooled everyone for about 2 centuries. When the first jaws came out of the Maastricht chalk in the 1770s, and for generation after that, the animal was drawn with a long, tapering, eel-like tail, a body that rippled from end to end like a thick sea snake. It looked reasonable. The bones of the tail narrow smoothly toward the tip, with no obvious hinge or kink to suggest anything more. So the reconstruction held quietly, unchallenged, through more than 200 years of museum paintings and textbook diagrams. Then, in 2013, a single exceptional fossil from Jordan rewrote it. Published in Nature Communications, the specimen preserved not just bone, but the shadow of the soft tissue around it. The fin itself printed into the rock as a stain, and that stain showed something the bones alone had hidden. The tail was not a simple tapering rope. It carried a fin with 2 lobes, a shark-like blade, technically bilobed and hypercircle, meaning the lower lobe was the larger one. The downturn in the tail vertebrae that earlier scientists had read as damage or as a meaningless quirk turned out to be structural. The spine bent down into the bottom lobe on purpose, the way it does in sharks, and a broad fleshy fin flared out above and below. That is the quiet lesson of the Jordan fossil. The bones had been telling the truth the whole time, but the flesh that gave them meaning was missing, and so the wrong story stood. Soft tissue preservation is rare because flesh rots in days while bone can last across the ages. It takes a specific kind of death and burial, a quick sinking into fine oxygen-starved mud, mineral-rich water seeping in before the microbes finish their work to freeze a fin in place. When it happens, you get to see what the skeleton only implies. The Jordan mosasaur is one of those gifts, a single slab that quietly corrected 200 years of careful, confident, mistaken drawing. The colour came from an even smaller reading. In 2014, researchers looked at fossilised mosasaur skin under magnification, powerful enough to resolve structures far below anything the eye could catch. What they found were melanosomes, tiny pigment-bearing sacs, the same microscopic bodies that carry dark colour in living animals, in your own skin, in a crow's feather, in a leatherback turtle's back. In life, these sacs hold melanin. In the fossil, the melanin itself is long gone, but the little containers that held it can survive printed into the mineral, keeping their shape and their crowding. And they were crowded. The melanosomes sat packed dense and dark, clustered as thickly as grains scorched into a piece of burnt toast, the kind of density that in a living animal reads as deep pigment, grey shading toward black. Not a guess about mood or fashion, a direct count of surviving structures compared against the skin of animals alive today. The pattern that emerged was countershading, the oldest trick in the ocean. Dark along the back, paler beneath. Seen from above, the dark spine blends into the black depths below. Seen from below, the lighter belly washes out against the bright ceiling of the sunlit surface. The same scheme a leatherback wears now. The mosasaur wore it tens of millions of years before, and you can read it off the fossil, almost like reading the animal's own instructions for hiding. If you are drifting with all this, let it settle slowly and follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. There is more of the sea ahead. The strangest reading of all is the temperature, because heat leaves no bone and no fin. You cannot fossilize warmth. Yet in 2010, in the journal Science, a team led by Bernard found a way to take the temperature of an animal dead for tens of millions of years, using nothing but the chemistry locked inside its teeth and bone. Here is the idea, and it is worth walking through slowly because it is a small marvel. Oxygen comes in more than one weight. Most oxygen atoms are light, but a small fraction are a heavier version, carrying a couple of extra units of mass. When an animal grows a tooth or lays down bone, it pulls oxygen out of the water in its body and builds it into the mineral of the tissue. The ratio of heavy oxygen to light oxygen that gets locked in depends, in a precise and repeatable way, on the temperature at which the mineral formed. Warm tissue traps one ratio, cooler tissue traps another. The relationship is steady enough that the chemistry works like a thermometer that was left inside the bone at the moment it grew, and then buried, and then read back out in a laboratory an age later. So the team measured that ratio in mosasaur bone, and in the bone of other sea reptiles from the same seas, plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, and they compared it against the fish that swam alongside them. Fish are cold-blooded. Their body temperature simply matches the water, so their chemistry records the sea itself, and cools as you move toward the poles. The reptiles did not follow that rule. Their recorded temperatures stayed high and steady even where the surrounding water was cold, running to roughly 95 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not the temperature of the sea. That is the temperature of a body holding its own heat, warmer than the water it moved through, a warmth carried in the blood the way you carry yours through a cold room. That number is the heart of the case that mosasaurs were, in some meaningful sense, warm-blooded, endothermic, homeothermic, an animal that made its own heat and held it steady rather than surrendering to whatever the water offered. Later work, including a 2016 study by Harrell and colleagues, examined more specimens with the same isotope approach and pointed the same direction, elevated temperatures that did not track latitude, the signature of an animal running its own furnace. But be honest about what this is, because the science is honest about it. No one measured a living mosasaur's temperature. What was measured is a ratio of oxygen atoms in ancient mineral, and from that ratio the warmth is inferred, reasoned backward through chemistry, not observed. It is an indirect argument, a strong one, supported from more than one direction, yet still an argument built on proxies rather than a reading taken from a living body. How warm the animal truly ran, how it made and kept that heat, whether the regulation was as complete as a mammal's or something looser and stranger. These remain open questions, worked on now, not closed. The most careful voices call it a well-supported inference and leave the door to further evidence standing open. That honesty is not weakness. It is the difference between a picture painted from data and a picture painted from wishing. Set the three readings side by side and notice how little any of them relied on the obvious. The tail came from a flesh stain in a single lucky Jordanian slab, not from the bones that had been sitting in museums for 2 centuries. The colour came from counting sacs far too small to see, structures emptied of their pigment yet still holding their crowded shape. The warmth came from weighing 2 kinds of oxygen against each other and letting the ratio speak. Not one of these is a fossil you could simply look at and understand. Each needed a technique that did not exist when the first jaw came out of the chalk, a way of asking the stone a question it was never designed to answer. And each answer built the same creature, from 3 unrelated angles that did not have to agree. A dark, counter-shaded body, greater black above and pale below, vanishing into whichever direction you did not expect. A shark-like tail with a broad lower lobe driving from behind. Blood running warm and steady, warmer than the sea, holding a furnace against the cold of the deep water. 3 separate methods, 3 separate laboratories of evidence, and they converge on one animal that was faster, darker, and more alive than the slow, cold, eel-tailed lizard that stood in the books for so long. That is the animal the modern reading gives you. warm-blooded, or close to it, dark as scorched grain, tail flexed into a blade, an engine of an animal reconstructed not from imagination, but from stains and ratios and crowded microscopic sacs, each read back out of stone and age after the flesh was gone. It is a body assembled fact by patient fact, and every fact points the same way, toward speed, toward endurance, toward a predator built to cross open water and rule it. A body built like this needed a sea to match it, and such a sea once ran clear across the drowned heart of a continent. A body built like this needed a sea to match it, and such a sea once ran clear across the drowned heart of a continent. A body built like this needed a sea to match it, and such a sea once ran clear across the drowned heart of a continent. Picture North America, not as one land but as two, split down the middle by water. This was the Western Interior Seaway, and it stretched from the cold mouth of the Arctic Ocean in the north all the way south to the warm Gulf of Mexico. A single connected sea cutting the continent into an eastern island and a western island, with a broad reach of open water between them where nothing but wings could cross. It was not a deep ocean. That is the first thing to hold in your mind as you drift. This was an epicontinental sea, shallow flooding of the low interior of a landmass, more like a warm and enormous drowned plain than the black abyss of a true ocean basin. In central Kansas, at its very deepest, it reached only about 2,500 feet, half a mile of water at the most, and across vast stretches far less than that. You could have fallen through the whole of it in the time it takes to hold one long, slow thought. Let that scale settle over you before you go further, because the shallowness is the whole secret of the place. Stay here a while with me, and let the size of it hold you. Sunlight mattered in a sea this thin. Light poured down into the upper water and kept going deep into the column, so that the top of the seaway stayed lit and green and alive. Plankton bloomed in that sunlit layer in numbers past counting. Fish moved through it in schools. Reptiles rolled and turned in the brightness near the surface, warm water sliding over the dark skin. But the light did not always reach the bottom. In the deeper reaches, hundreds of feet down, the floor lay in cold and quiet dark, starved of oxygen, where almost nothing lived and only a slow rain of dead things came drifting down from the bright world above. That rain is worth watching, because it is still with us. The surface waters of the seaway were thick with coccolithophores, single-celled algae that armoured themselves in tiny plates of calcium carbonate. Each plate is smaller than a grain of dust. When those cells died, their armour sank, plate by microscopic plate, settling toward the seafloor like a soft and endless snow. Marine snow, falling for millions of years, no sound to it, no hurry. Layer on layer, that pale sediment built into chalk, hundreds of feet thick in places, the same chalk you find today in the bluffs of western Kansas. Geologists call it the Smoky Hill chalk, the upper member of the Niobrara Formation, and it is a window into the seaway around 87 to 82 million years ago. Read the rock and you read the water that made it. The chalk tells us the sea here was mild to subtropical, warm in the way the modern Gulf of Mexico is warm, with a salinity a touch below the ocean average because rivers off the western land kept feeding fresh water in. It tells us the bottom currents were weak, too weak to stir the deep water, so oxygen never reached the floor, and the seabed stayed low in oxygen and calm. That stillness was a gift to the future. On a lively, well-oxygenated seafloor, scavengers and burrowers pull a dead body apart within days and churn the sediment to ruin. On this quiet, oxygen-poor bottom, a carcass could come to rest in the soft coccolith mud and simply stay there, undisturbed, while the marine snow buried it whole. That is why the Smoky Hill chalk holds such extraordinary skeletons, articulated and complete, sometimes with the faint ghost of skin and soft tissue still traceable in the stone. The same weak currents that made the deep water a dead zone made it a perfect tomb. So set yourself in that water for a moment. Above you, the surface glitters, warm as a summer bath. Around you, in the lit and living layer, the sea is crowded and bright. Below you, the light thins to blue, then to grey, then to a cold nothing where the pale mud waits. And moving through the bright layer, the animals this whole episode circles back to, the mosasaurs, dark above and pale below, all but invisible from any angle, cutting slow lines through a sea that would one day become white stone. The Western Interior Seaway was the great stage, but it was not the only one, and it was not the last. The seaway was already draining and shrinking through the closing millions of years of the Cretaceous, retreating as the land slowly rose and the shorelines crept inward. And so the second great chapter of mosasaur life plays out on the far side of the world, on the shallow shelf seas that lapped the edges of what is now Europe. There, in the very last age of the Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian, a warm, shallow sea covered the low country where the Netherlands and Belgium meet today. This is the sea that gave the whole group its name, the water above the chalk of Maastricht, where the great skulls were later cut from the rock. It was another shallow shelf sea, warm and bright and rich, another drowned margin of a continent rather than a deep ocean. And it was in this water that the largest and last of them swam. Mosasaurus hoffmanni itself, the animal Cuvier would one day use to prove that whole kinds of life can vanish from the earth. By the end of the Cretaceous, both of these seas were changing in the same slow direction. The Western Interior Seaway freshened as rivers poured more and more fresh water into a shrinking basin, its salinity dropping as the sea pulled back toward the Gulf. Shallow seas the world over were in retreat. The stage was contracting even before the curtain fell. But while these waters lasted, they were among the most crowded and productive marine ecosystems the planet had ever grown, and they were ruled, top to bottom, by lizards that had gone back to the sea. Here is where the shape of that rule becomes interesting, because it was never one monster alone. A single kind of giant predator does not fill a sea. What the seaway held was a guild, and the guild is the idea worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. In ecology, a guild is a set of different species that make their living in the same broad way, in the same place, at the same time. The mosasaurs of the Western Interior Seaway were exactly that, a whole spread of related predators, sharing one sea and dividing its prey among themselves so finely that a dozen kinds could live side by side without starving one another out. They divided it by size, they divided it by tooth, they divided it by the depth they hunted and the speed they could hold. Think of it less as a single throne and more as a long table, each guest reaching for a different dish, and you will start to see how one sea fed so many giants at once. Before we walk that table, let me pause for just one small thing, and then I will not interrupt the water again. If this slow walk through deep time is the kind of thing that helps you sleep, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. That way the next long night is already waiting for you. Now let the sea close back over us, and let us meet the animals one at a time. Start small, near the bright surface, with Plesiosaurus. This was a mid-sized mosasaur, roughly 14 feet long, slender and quick. A pursuit hunter built for the chase rather than the crushing blow. Its teeth were fine and pointed, the teeth of an animal that eats fish, and fish are mostly what it ate. It ran down schooling prey in the sunlit water, turning fast, snapping, swallowing on the move. Plesiosaurus is also one of the best known of all mosasaurs, because a few specimens preserved soft tissue so well that scientists have read pigment from its skin and structures from its eye. When we talk about dark, counter-shaded mosasaur colour, much of that evidence comes from animals like this one. Picture it dark grey along the back, pale along the belly, sliding through a wall of silver fish, and vanishing into the glare above whenever it turned to look down. Beside Plesiosaurus, sharing the same water, swam Cledastes, smaller still and lighter, one of the more slender members of the whole family. Cledastes hunted the same bright upper layers, taking fish and soft prey, keeping to a size that let it slip through the crowd. And Cledastes matters for a reason beyond its own quiet life. because it turns up not only as a hunter, but as a meal, its bones found inside the gut of something far larger. We will come to that larger animal in a moment. For now, hold Cledastes as one of the small, fast, fish-eating members of the guild, filling the low end of the table where the big teeth did not bother to reach. Now let the water open and the shadow grow, because here comes the top of the table, Tylosaurus. This was one of the giants of the seaway, reaching an estimated 43 to 46 feet, as long as many of the largest Mosasaurus. Its signature is at the front of the skull, a long, solid, toothless snout, a bony ram extending past the first teeth. Paleontologists think that rostrum was used exactly as it looks, driven into prey as a battering weapon, stunning or wounding an animal before the jaws came round to finish it. Tylosaurus was no specialist. It was the great generalist of the guild, and we know what it ate because at least one specimen from the Niobrara chalk died with its last meal still inside it. That one stomach is worth lingering over, because it tells you almost everything about the top of this sea in a single fossil. Inside the gut cavity of a large Tylosaurus proroga, paleontologists found the remains of a bony fish called Banogmius, a diving bird called Hesperornis, a smaller mosasaur, our friend Cledastes, and a shark. One predator, 4 very different prey from 4 different corners of the ecosystem. A fish from the schools, a bird from the surface, a reptile from its own kind, and a shark from among its rivals. That is what a true apex generalist looks like, an animal that ate whatever the sea offered and was too large to fear much of it. Between the fish-eaters and the giants ran the middle of the table, and here the tooth shape starts to change. The genus Prognathodon spanned an enormous range across its many species, from around 20 feet up to something close to 46 feet, rivaling the largest of all. But size is not its most telling feature. Prognathodon carried robust, rounded, powerfully built teeth and heavy jaws, the equipment of an animal that could bite through things that fought back with armour rather than speed. In some species it was Gyrophagus, a crusher of hard shells. Where Tylosaurus rammed and Platecarpus chased, Prognathodon could bear down and break, opening prey that a pointed-toothed hunter would leave alone. And then, at the far end of the table, sits the strangest and most specialised guest of all, Globidens. The name means globe teeth, and that is exactly what it grew. Where nearly every other mosasaur carried blades and points and cones for cutting and gripping flesh, Globidens evolved bulbous, rounded, almost spherical teeth, low domes of enamel set in strong jaws. These were not made for slicing anything, they were made for crushing. Globidens fed on the hard-shelled animals of the seaway, the thick-coiled ammonites and the heavy clams, closing its jaws and popping the shells to get at the soft body inside. It is a beautiful example of what a guild allows. By specialising so completely on armoured prey, Globidens simply stepped out of the competition entirely, eating the one thing most of its neighbours could not. So look at the whole table now, laid end to end. Small, fast Clydastes and Platecarpus working the fish schools near the surface, middle-sized crushers like Prognathodon breaking tougher prey, the giant generalist Tylosaurus taking anything it pleased, with its bony ram and its stomach full of 4 different worlds, the shell crusher Globidens quietly emptying the ammonites, and moving among them, and in the European sea outliving many of them, the great Mosasaurus itself, the largest and last, with cutting teeth and a jaw that could flex to swallow prey, most hunters could not manage. This is the guild, a single sea partitioned so finely that the giants never had to fight over every meal. It worked because the sea beneath them was so full. A guild of predators this rich needs a prey base to match, and the western interior seaway had one, stacked in layers from the surface to the mud. Sink slowly through it now and meet the hunted. Near the top, drifting through the bright water, were the ammonites. These were shelled relatives of squid and octopus, soft bodies tucked inside coiled shells lined with gas-filled chambers that let them float and hover. Some grew coiled tight like a ram's horn. Others, the ones called baculites, uncoiled almost entirely into long, straight, tapering shells that hung in the water like slender spears. They drifted in enormous numbers through the seaway, and their shells, fossilized by the million, are among the most common fossils the chalk and shale hold. To globidans they were dinner. To the crushing jaws of prognathodon they were a shell to be broken, and on some of their fossilized shells, as we will see soon, there are marks that may record the exact moment a mosasaur closed its teeth on them. Below and among the ammonites swam the fish, and the seaway held fish in staggering variety and number. Bananogmius, the very fish found in that Tylosaurus stomach, was one of many. A deep-bodied bony fish moving in schools through the middle water. There were fish of every size in that sea, from small schooling prey up to enormous predatory fish that were themselves a danger to smaller reptiles. The schools were the base of the whole pyramid, the sunlit fuel that everything above them burned. Then, cutting down from the surface, came the divers. Hesperornis was a bird, but not a bird of the air. It had lost the power of flight and become a creature of the water, a large streamlined, foot-propelled diver with a long neck and a beak still lined with small teeth. It could not walk well on land, and it could not fly at all, but underwater it was superb, chasing fish down through the column much as a modern loon or cormorant does. Hesperornis broke the surface to breathe and dove again to hunt, and each time it did, it entered the same water as the mosasaurs. The Tylosaurus stomach tells us plainly what could happen when a diving bird and a giant reptile met in the same stretch of sea. Sharing that water too were the sea turtles, and here we cross to the European Sea for one of its signature residents, Alapleuron hoffmanni. This was a giant pelagic turtle of the late Maastrichtian, its carapace running roughly 3 to 6 feet long, an open-water swimmer rather than a coast-hugger. Chemistry read from its fossils, the isotopes locked in its bones, points to a carnivorous diet. Curiously, almost every known fossil of Alapleuron is an adult, which suggests the young lived somewhere else entirely, perhaps sheltered nurseries among seagrass meadows, growing up out of reach of the open sea giants before venturing into deeper water. This turtle shared the exact same shallow Maastrichtian sea as Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the great turtle and the great lizard moving through the same warm shelf water at the very end of the age, and through all of it, at every level, cruised the sharks. They patrolled the seaway alongside the mosasaurs, competitors and occasionally prey, occasionally predators in their own right. Another set of teeth in an already crowded sea. The shark in the Tylosaurus stomach reminds us the relationship ran both ways. In a sea this full, even the hunters were on the menu. Hold the whole thing in your mind at once, the way you might hold the shape of a room in the dark before you sleep. A shallow sea, warm as the Gulf, laid across the sunken middle of a continent. Sunlight streaming down through green and living water, ammonites and long straight baculites drifting near the top. Schools of Bananogmius and countless other fish threading the middle depths. Hesperornis diving and surfacing, a turtle the size of a small boat gliding past, sharks turning in the blue, and woven all through that bright layer, the guild of great lizards, small and swift near the surface, giant and patient below, each tuned by tooth and size to its own share of the feast, dark backs and pale bellies fading into the light from below and into the dark from above. Beneath them all, the cold, still, oxygen-starved floor, the pale coccolith snow settling grain by grain, building the chalk that would one day carry every one of these animals forward into stone. It is a strange comfort, this picture, a sea that has been gone for tens of millions of years, still readable in the rock, still full of animals if you know how to look. You could almost drift off inside it, floating in that warm, shallow water among creatures none of us will ever see move. Take one slow breath and let the sea hold your weight for a moment, the way it once held theirs. But a sea this crowded raises a hard question, and it is the question this whole picture has been circling toward. All these hunters, all these teeth, all these bodies stacked from the sunlit top to the dead cold bottom. What did it actually mean to eat here, day after day, among rivals your own size and prey that could crack a jaw or slip a school in an instant? How did a ramming Tylosaurus, A crushing globidens, a flexing-jawed mosasaurus each take their meal without starving beside the others. That is where we turn next, from the shape of the sea to the act of feeding itself. Line them up in the mind, largest to smallest, and let each one settle before the next moves in. Start with the animal that lent the whole family its name, Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the type species, the one whose jaw first came out of the chalk near Maastricht in the 1770s. The best supported skeletons, the ones built from real skulls and vertebrae rather than guesswork, put it at roughly 39 to 46 feet, from the tip of the snout to the last bone of the tail. Picture a body longer than a city bus laid out along the seabed and still overhanging at both ends. Now give it weight. The largest individuals are modelled at somewhere around 22,000 to 33,000 pounds, which is to say 10 to 15 metric tons of muscle and bone and cold, dark, oil-rich flesh. That is the mass of a loaded delivery truck moving without a sound, driven forward by a single long stroke of the tail. There are larger numbers whispered around this animal, and honesty means saying them softly and then setting them aside. A few researchers, working from broken jaw fragments and scaling them up by body proportion ratios, have suggested lengths closer to 56 or 59 feet. Other paleontologists look at those same methods and shake their heads, because jaw-to-body ratios tend to run long, and a partial bone can lie to you about the animal it came from, so treat the giant figures as an open question, an upper edge that may never be confirmed, and keep the well-grounded number close, a well-supported 40-odd feet, already monstrous, already more than enough. This was a creature of the Campanian and the Maastrichtian, the last two stages of the Cretaceous, alive across a span from about 82.7 million years ago down to the very end at 66. Its bones have surfaced on nearly every continent, Antarctica included, which tells you these seas were connected and warm enough that one lineage of giant lizards could patrol from pole to pole. That is the flagship. But the sea was not built for one animal, and the role of its neighbours is where the guild comes alive. Bring in Tylosaurus proroger next, because in raw length it stood shoulder to shoulder with Mosasaurus itself. Estimates run to 43 to 46 feet, an animal you could measure against 3 canoes set nose to tail with a little room to spare. What set Tylosaurus apart was the front of its face. The snout ended in a long, solid, toothless spur of bone, a rostrum with no cutting edge, thought by many to have worked as a ram. Imagine that mass of an animal building speed through open water and driving the bony point of its own skull into the flank of its prey, stunning it before the jaws ever opened. And the jaws, when they opened, took nearly anything. One Tylosaurus recovered from the Niobrara chalk of Kansas was preserved with its last meal still inside the ribcage. A bony fish called Bananogmius, a diving seabird called Hesperornis, a smaller mosasaur named Cledastes, and a shark. 4 animals from 4 corners of the food web, all in one gut, a single predator eating across the whole column of the sea. Tylosaurus also turns up in the Pierre Shale, so its range stretched well beyond that one chalk seabed. Set beside those 2 giants, the genus Prognathodon, which is less a single animal than a range of them. Across its several species, Prognathodon spanned from about 20 feet, at the small end up to something near 46 feet at the large, roughly the reach of Tylosaurus in its biggest forms. What marks Prognathodon is the build of the head and teeth. In several species the teeth are heavy and rounded, the jaws thick and powerful, an arrangement suited to durophagy, the crushing of hard-shelled prey. This was a generalist that could also bite down on something armoured and simply break it, or a thin-toothed hunter would have slid off. You can feel, moving down the list, how the guild spreads itself out. Not everyone chased the same fast fish. Some animals leaned into the parts of the menu that fought back with shell instead of speed. No animal made that choice more completely than Globidens. The name means globe teeth, and the teeth earn it. Instead of the pointed backward-curving cones of a typical mosasaur, Globidens grew bulbous, rounded crowns, smooth and heavy, closer in shape to river stones worn round by water than to blades. Picture a mouth paved with those domes, top and bottom, meeting like a mill. This was an animal that had given up the chase almost entirely and specialised in the crushing of ammonites and clams and other thick-shelled prey. It would take a coiled ammonite the way you might take a walnut in a nutcracker, position it against the crushing plates and press until the shell failed, and the soft body inside was exposed. In a sea thick with shelled animals that was a rich and defended larder, and Globidon held the key to it. Then step down in size because the guild was not only giants. Platecarpus was a mid-sized mosasaur, roughly 14 feet long, an animal you could nearly stretch out beside and measure against your own reach several times over. It was a pursuit predator built for fish rather than for armour, or for large struggling prey, slimmer in the jaw, quicker in the water, hunting the schools that shimmered through the sunlit upper layers. Platecarpus matters for another reason too. It is one of the best studied of all mosasaurs, because certain specimens preserved soft tissue, not just bone. From that soft tissue, researchers have read the pigment structures in the skin and even details of the eye, the kind of evidence that lets us say, with real fossils behind it, that these animals were dark above and pale below. So, this ordinary middle-sized fish hunter turned out to carry some of the clearest windows we have into what a living mosasaur actually looked like. Smaller still swam clidasts, a slighter mosasaurin that shared the Niobrara and the wider western interior seaway with all the larger kinds. You met it already, though you may not have marked it, because Clydastes was the smaller mosasaur found inside the stomach of that Tylosaurus. That single fossil does a great deal of quiet work. It tells us these animals were not spread out in polite isolation, each to its own private water. They overlapped, and the large ate the small of their own kind, one mosasaur ending inside another. Clydastes was predator to the fish it caught, and prey to the giants above it, occupying a middle rung on a ladder that ran from the smallest hunter to the largest, all of them lizards, all of them breathing air, all of them sharing one warm and crowded sea. And at the small, strange edge of the family, cross to the far side of the world and find Phosphorosaurus pompitelegans, recovered in Japan and only about 10 feet long. That is a modest animal, the length of a small rowboat, easy to overlook beside a 40-foot giant. But its skull holds something the giants lacked. Its eyes faced forward rather than out to the sides, and the overlap of their fields of view has been estimated at about 35 degrees of true binocular vision. For a lizard, that is remarkable. Most non-snake squamates manage only 10 to 20 degrees of overlap, so this small hunter roughly doubled the range where its two eyes saw the same patch of water at once. That overlap is what gives depth, the ability to judge exactly how far away a thing is before you commit to the strike. Researchers read it as an adaptation for low light, for hunting in the dim water at dusk or in the deep, perhaps chasing prey that gave itself away with its own faint glow. While the giants ruled the bright surface by size and speed, this small animal claimed the darker hours by seeing better into them. Hold all 7 in mind together now, and the shape of the thing appears. Mosasaurus at 40-odd feet and up to 30-odd thousand pounds. Tylosaurus nearly as long, leading with a battering ram of bone. Prognathodon ranging from 20 feet to 40-odd, thick-jawed and adaptable. Globidons with its mouth of smooth crushing domes. Platecarpus at 14 feet chasing fish through the light. Clydastes smaller still, both hunter and meal. And little Phosphorosaurus at 10 feet, seeing in the dark what the others could not. These were not rivals for a single dinner. They were a division of one, each with its own size, its own teeth, its own preferred depth and prey and hour of the day, layered through the same warm water like the stories of a drowned and living tower. Every genus was a wager on a different way to make a living in a sea already packed with more mouths than the eye could hold. In water this crowded, the question was never whether you would eat, but how and what you would leave behind in the mud. In water this crowded, the question was never whether you would eat, but how and what you would leave behind in the mud. Consider one animal that answered that question and left the answer inside its own body. A large Tylosaurus proregia, One of the giants of the group, reaching perhaps 43 to 46 feet, was pulled from the Niobrara chalk of Kansas with its last meal still lodged where its stomach had been. Not one meal, several, and not one kind of prey, but 4. Picture what that single fossil records. Down inside the ribs lay the bones of a bony fish called Bananogmius, a slab-sided swimmer of the open seaway. Beside it, the remains of a Hesperornis, one of the flightless diving birds that hunted these waters, a creature that swam more than it ever flew. There too were the bones of a smaller mosasaur, a Cleidasts, swallowed by its larger cousin, and a shark taken down alongside the rest. A fish, a bird, a reptile, and a shark, all in one belly. That is not a fussy eater. That is an animal that took whatever the sea handed it and asked no further questions. Sit with that image for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about how these predators lived. This Tylosaurus had a long, solid, toothless snout at the tip of its jaws, a rostrum of dense bone that many researchers think it used to ram and stun its prey before biting. A blunt, battering point of bone at the front, then the rows of curved teeth behind. Whatever it struck, it could carry down into the gut, whole or in pieces, and the pieces stacked there like a menu written in bone. When you find 4 different animals inside one predator, you're not looking at a specialist. You're looking at a generalist near the very top of the food chain, a mouth that the whole living column of the seaway had to reckon with. That is direct evidence, the best kind paleontology can offer. Not a guess about diet from tooth shape alone, but the actual food fossilized in place. The Last Supper turned to stone, and it invites a gentle engagement, a small question to carry with you into the dark. When you imagine a sea monster, you probably imagine one enormous shape hunting one kind of prey. The real animals were messier and hungrier than that, opportunists that would eat a bird one day and a relative the next. Keep that in mind as we go deeper, because the deeper we go, the stranger and more human these creatures start to feel. Now, not every mosasaur ate this way. The seaway was wide enough and long-lived enough to reward specialists as well as generalists, and some of them specialized in a way that seems almost gentle by comparison. Where Tylosaurus had curved, cutting, gripping teeth, other mosasaurs went in the opposite direction entirely. They traded knives for hammers. Meet Globidens, whose very name points at its most striking feature. Instead of the pointed, blade-edged teeth typical of most mosasaurs, Globidens evolved bulbous, rounded, low-domed teeth, like rows of smooth riverstones set into the jaw. Teeth built not to slice but to crush. This is what paleontologists call durophagy, the eating of hard-shelled things, and it is a whole way of life. A Globidens was not chasing fast fish through open water. It was working the shelled larder of the seaway, the clams and the coiled ammonites and the other armoured drifters, and simply breaking them open. Imagine biting down and feeling a shell give way between blunt teeth, the way you might crack a walnut in a closed fist. That slow, patient crunching was a Globidens at its meal. Some species of Prognathodon did much the same. Prognathodon was a sprawling genus, ranging across its species from perhaps 20 feet up to something like the largest mosasaurs, 40-odd feet long, and it was mostly a generalist. But some of its kinds carried especially robust, rounded teeth, built stout and heavy for the same shell-cracking work. So within this single family of marine lizards you had, at the same time, sleek fish catchers, blunt-nosed rammers, and these thick-jawed shell crushers, all dividing the sea between them. The seaway was not ruled by one monster. It was partitioned, carefully, into overlapping territories of appetite, each genus reaching for prey the others left alone. Which brings us to the ammonites, and to one of the quieter detective stories in all of paleontology. Ammonites were the coiled, chambered relatives of today's squid and nautilus, and they drifted through these seas in enormous numbers, their spiral shells ranging from the size of a coin to the size of a wagon wheel. For a shell crusher, an ammonite was a sealed package of soft meat behind a hard coiled door. The question is whether the mosasaurs were the ones knocking. For a long time that was genuinely uncertain, and it is worth telling you plainly, because honesty about doubt is part of this. Fossil ammonite shells, especially a broad flattened kind called plesiosaurus, sometimes turn up pocked with neat round to oval holes. 2 rows of them, or clusters, punched clean through the shell. The obvious reading is a bite, 2 jaws of teeth closing on the shell and leaving paired puncture marks. But there was a rival explanation, and it was not a foolish one. Limpets, small grazing snails, sometimes settle onto a surface and rasp out a shallow home scar, a resting depression exactly their own shape. Some researchers argued that these holes in the ammonites were not bites at all, but limpet scars, the slow work of tiny snails misread as the violence of a giant. So which was it? A crushing predator or a quiet grazing snail? The way you answer a question like that is not by arguing louder, but by counting. In 2001, Tsujita and Westerman worked systematically through more than 150 specimens of plesiosaurus from the Bear Paw Formation of Alberta. They looked at the holes carefully, at their shape, their spacing, their pairing, the way they lined up against the geometry of a mosasaur's tooth rows, and across that large sample, the damage matched mosasaur bite patterns far more often than it matched limpet home scars. The weight of the evidence swung toward predation. The mosasaurs, or at least some of them, really were biting these ammonites, cracking the coiled shells to reach the animal inside. Be careful with a result like that, though, and I want to be careful with you here in the dark because the truthful shape of it matters more than a clean story. This does not mean every hole in every ammonite is a bite. For any single specimen, the debate is not fully closed, and a given mark might still be something else. What the large study showed is a pattern, a tendency across many shells, that favours the mosasaur over the snail. That is how much of this science actually works. Not one perfect fossil settling everything, but 150 imperfect ones counted patiently until the balance tips. You can let that patience settle over you as you drift. Somewhere in a museum drawer in Alberta, those punctured spirals are still sitting, waiting to be counted again. This is a good place to pause for one small thing before we go on into stranger territory. If these slow walks through deep time are becoming part of how you fall asleep, you can follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. That is all. No hurry. We were talking about what these animals ate, and we have arrived at the hardest part of that, the part where the menu turns to include their own kind. Come with me now to Angola, to the rocks of the old South Atlantic margin, and to a fossil that stops you cold. A mosasaur was recovered there with its gut contents preserved, the way that Tylosaurus in Kansas had been. But what lay inside this one was not a fish, and a bird, and a shark. Inside this mosasaur were 3 other mosasaurs, 3 smaller individuals, and here is the detail that makes it eerie, of 3 different species. Their bones were etched and pitted by stomach acid, half digested, stacked inside the ribs of the animal that had swallowed them. 1 belly, 3 of its own kind, 3 kinds of its own kind. Let that sink in slowly. The largest predators in the last great sea sometimes ate mosasaurs. That much the Angola fossil makes undeniable. But how they came to eat them is a more delicate question, and again the honest answer has an open edge to it. Researchers who studied this specimen leaned toward an interpretation that softens the picture a little. They read this animal not as a relentless hunter of its own relatives, tracking and killing 3 separate mosasaurs of 3 species, but more likely as a scavenger, a body feeder. An animal moving through a sea that was, at times, littered with mosasaur carcasses and simply feeding on the dead where it found them. That reading makes sense of the details. Killing 3 living mosasaurs of 3 different species would take a great deal of luck and effort. Finding 3 dead ones drifting or settling in a rich, crowded sea takes only a good nose and an open mouth. And it fits something we already know about the biggest predators everywhere, in every age. The top of a food chain is not a place of constant heroic combat. It's a place where energy is precious, and a free meal, a carcass already dead, is never refused. Even the monster at the very peak of the Cretaceous sea did not always kill what it ate. Still, do not let the scavenging reading erase the darker possibility entirely, because the two are not exclusive. We have that Cleidastes inside the Kansas Tylosaurus, a smaller mosasaur inside a larger one, and there is no reason a hungry giant would not take a living smaller cousin if the chance arose. Mosasaur ate mosasaur, sometimes as a hunter, taking the weak or the young or the merely unlucky, sometimes as a scavenger, cleaning the dead from the water. The line between those two for an opportunist was never firm. When you were large enough, everything smaller than you, alive or dead, was potential food, and that included the animals that shared your own shape. The sea was a single long body, and it fed on itself. Think for a moment about what that means for a young mosasaur trying to grow up in these waters. It was not enough to fear the sharks and the largest fish. The greatest danger to a small mosasaur was often a large mosasaur, a bigger version of itself with the same jaws and the same hunger, only more of it. To reach the size of a Tylosaurus or a Mosasaurus, an animal had to survive years of being exactly the sort of prey it would one day swallow. Most did not survive it. That is the quiet arithmetic behind every giant. For each one that grew huge, many smaller ones vanished into the mud or into a larger belly. And yet, against all of that danger, the mosasaurs did something remarkable. They found a way to bring new life directly into this hazardous open water, and to do it without ever touching land. This is where the family part of their story turns tender, and where the science becomes, in its own quiet way, beautiful. Most lizards lay eggs. Their ancestors did, the small shore-hugging lizards from which the mosasaur line descended. To lay eggs, you generally need a shore, a beach, a bank, some dry ground where a clutch can rest and breathe through the shell. A fully ocean-going animal cannot do that. It cannot haul its long, flippered, unsupported body up a beach the way a sea turtle can. So somewhere on the road from shore lizard to sea monster, the mosasaur lineage had to solve the problem of birth in a body that could never come ashore. They solved it by keeping the young inside and giving birth to them live, in the water. Viviparity. Live-bearing, the same solution that whales and dolphins and dugongs would arrive at much later, by entirely separate roads. We can actually watch that solution appear in the fossil record, earlier in the family tree than the great pelagic mosasaurs themselves. There is a fossil of a gravid female from the precursor lineage, an agilosaur-grade animal called Carsosaurus, and inside her body lie at least 4 advanced embryos, not eggs. Embryos, well developed, positioned in the back 2/3 of her trunk. And here is the detail that makes paleontologists lean close. The little ones are oriented as if they were born tail first. Tail first. That single word carries a whole survival strategy. Think about a newborn air breather delivered into water. If it emerges head first, its head is out and exposed while the rest of the body is still held inside the mother, and those first crucial moments can drown it before it ever draws breath. Delivered tail first, the head comes last, so the newborn is only fully free at the final instant, ready to rise and breathe at once. Living whales and dugongs are born this way, tail first, for exactly this reason, and here in this ancient gravid female the same arrangement is already present. The problem of drowning your own young, and its elegant solution, was worked out in these marine lizards tens of millions of years before the whales existed. And notice what this fossil settles about timing. Live birth in this lineage evolved before the animals became fully creatures of the open sea. The Carsosaurus mother is not yet a great ocean giant. She belongs to that earlier, more shore-tide grade, which means the mosasaurs did not have to invent live birth after they committed to the ocean. They carried it with them into the ocean, already solved as a kind of inheritance. that freed the entire lineage from the shore forever. No returning to a beach to nest, no clutch of vulnerable eggs on a bank. The young were carried, then born swimming, out where the water was deep. Live birth was the key that unlocked the open sea, and they held that key before they walked all the way through the door. There is one more piece of this, and it is my favourite because it began as a mistake. Back in the late 1800s, collectors working the Niobrara chalk of Kansas kept turning up very small, delicate reptile bones. Tiny things, far out in what had been open ocean, hundreds of miles in deep time from any shore where eggs could ever have been laid. The bones were so small and so slight that at first they were misidentified. They were thought to be the bones of birds, little seabird remains scattered through the chalk. They were not birds. They were newborn mosasaurs, babies, born out at sea, their fragile bones settling into the same soft white coccolith mud that buried their giant parents. Once you understand that mosasaurs gave live birth in open water, those tiny bones stop being a puzzle and become a nursery. The young were not born on any coast. They were born out there, in the blue, in the deepest part of the seaway, and some of them died there too and drifted down through the marine snow to the dark floor, and waited in the chalk until someone mistook them for birds. The mistake itself is the evidence. Nobody expected baby sea lizards in the middle of the ocean, because nobody expected them to be born there. But there they were. Hold that whole picture together now the way the rock holds it. A sea stacked with life from the sunlit top to the dark, low-oxygen floor. Ammonites drifting and being cracked open like walnuts by blunt-toothed crushers. Fish and diving birds and sharks all vanishing into the same wide jaws. Mosasaurs feeding on mosasaurs, sometimes as hunters, more often, it seems, as scavengers cleaning the dead from the water. And through all of it, new mosasaurs arriving live into that danger, delivered tail first so they would not drown before their first breath, then swimming off into a world that would very likely eat them before they grew large enough to do the eating themselves. It is a complete world, self-contained and self-consuming. It ran on its own logic for a span of time so long it is hard to hold in one mind. These were not brief experiments. The mosasaurs were the reigning predators of these seas across roughly the last 25 million years of the age of dinosaurs, generation folding into generation, the same dramas of birth and hunger and death playing out again and again, each one leaving its faint record in the settling chalk. A tooth mark on a shell, a belly full of bones, a cluster of newborn bones far from any shore. Layer on layer, quiet and slow, the white mud kept the receipts. You could almost believe it would go on forever, a sea that fed on itself and renewed itself endlessly, birth answering death in the warm subtropical water. Nothing in that world suggested an ending. The ammonites drifted, the crushers cracked them, the giants cruised the dark boundary between light and depth, and the young were born swimming into the blue. There was no sign in any of it that the whole arrangement was resting on borrowed time. Picture the water above that seabed as a tall room with a lit ceiling and a floor lost in shadow. Near the surface the light is generous. Sunlight pours down through the upper column, warm and moving, and everything alive gathers where it reaches. The Smoky Hill chalk was forming here, roughly 87 to 82 million years ago, in water about as warm as the Gulf of Mexico is today. Mild, faintly less salty than the open ocean, subtropical at top. If you hung there just below the waves, the light would fall around you in slow shifting columns, bending as the swell passed overhead. But light does not travel far in seawater, and this sea was deep in places. In central Kansas, the seaway reached down some 2,500 feet at its deepest, and long before you sank that far the brightness would drain away. Blue first, then grey, then a cold and total dark. The floor of this room lay hundreds of feet below the lit ceiling, in water starved of oxygen, where almost nothing stirred. Two worlds stacked in one column of water, the living roof and the dead cellar, joined only by what fell between them, and something was always falling. Look closely at the water in the light, and you would see it drifting down, fine and endless white rain. This was marine snow, the settling debris of the surface world. Most of it was coccoliths, the microscopic armour plates of single-celled algae that bloomed in the sunlit layer by the countless billion, lived and died. Their tiny calcite shields sank when they died, drifting down through the shaft of light like flour sifted slowly in a still kitchen, catching the sun as they turned. Grain by grain, this pale snow settled and pressed and hardened into chalk. The same chalk still cut from the ground at Maastricht, an ocean and 8,000 miles away, was built this way, one dead bloom at a time. That is the strange arithmetic under all of it. The white cliffs and quarried blocks of a later world are the slow corpses of plankton, laid down as gently as dust settling on a windowsill. You would not feel it landing. It falls too softly for that. But it never stops, and given enough patience it becomes stone hundreds of feet thick. Now let your eye climb back up the column, because the life here was arranged in tidy layers, each depth with its own tenants. Right near the top and the surface belonged to the ammonites. Coiled shells the size of a dinner plate or a wagon wheel, hanging in the water, trailing arms, drifting where the current took them. Among them floated the baculites, ammonite cousins whose shells uncoiled into long straight tapering rods, so that a school of them stood in the water like a scatter of pale spears. They fed on the tiny drifting life of the plankton, and they were fed upon in turn, which is the whole shape of this place. Below and around them moved the fish. Schools of them turned as one bright sheet, catching light on their flanks, animals like Bananogmius flickering through the upper water. Where fish gathered, hunters gathered. Sharks patrolled the middle depths on their slow, untiring circuits, sensing movement long before they saw it. And through the same water slid the smaller mosasaurs, the fish specialists, animals like plate carpus at around 14 feet, and the slighter cladasts, built for the quick chase rather than the crushing bite. They hunted the schools, matching every turn, feeding where the light was still good. There were divers here too, arriving from above. Hesperornis was a flightless seabird, a swimmer with tiny, useless wings and strong paddling feet, a mouth still lined with teeth. It hunted the way a loon hunts, plunging from the surface and driving down after fish, a visitor from the air folding itself briefly into the water and then breaking back up for breath. And gliding among all of it were the sea turtles. Alapleuron, a giant of the late chalk seas with a shell 3 to 6 feet long, cruised these waters on a carnivorous diet, an old and patient traveller moving between the surface for air and the beds below to feed. So the column was full, from the bright roof down through the fish and the reptiles and the drifting shells, every layer leased to something. But that fullness had a flaw, and the flaw was a different country entirely. Sink past the last of the light and the water goes still in a way that is hard to imagine while awake. The bottom currents here were weak, barely moving, and the deep water was stagnant and low in oxygen. Nothing churned it, nothing refreshed it. It simply lay there, cold and heavy and quiet, sealed off from the busy surface as thoroughly as a cellar is sealed from the sky. The marine snow that had fallen all this way settled onto the mud and stayed, undisturbed, because there was little on the bottom with the breath to disturb it. Where the surface teemed, the floor was a closed room with the door long since shut. That contrast is worth resting in. The same body of water held a garden and a tomb, one stacked on the other, and the animals of the light lived their whole lives above a darkness most of them never entered. When they died, they sank into it. Their bones came to rest on that quiet floor and were slowly buried by the falling white, which is exactly why so much of this world survives to be read. The stillness that made the deep water dead also made it a keeper of records. Now stop moving and listen, because the sea was never truly silent. Underwater, sound carries far and slow, and this one carried a low and constant murmur. There were the small clicks and groans of unseen life passing at the edge of hearing, There was the sudden clean splash overhead as a diving Hesperornis broke the surface and pushed down through the bright layer after a fish, a burst of bubbles, and then the fading hiss of its wake. There was the softer sound of a turtle rising for air far above, a brief disturbance, and then quiet closing over it again. And under all of that, if a long body was near, you would feel more than hear it. A mosasaur moving through the water pushes a pressure wave ahead of itself, a swelling in the water you sense on the skin before any sound arrives. These animals swam with side-to-side strokes of a deep muscular tail, tipped in the larger species with a shark-like fluke, rolling and driving forward with a slow economy of motion. The wake of such a body sliding past would reach you as a pulse, a shouldering of the water, the felt weight of something large passing close in the dark. In a place with little light that was often the first warning anything got. Not a sight, a pressure. The hunters themselves were built for exactly these conditions. Their skin was dark, grey to black across the back and paler on the belly, the counter-shading you see on a leatherback turtle today. Seen from below against the bright ceiling, that pale underside all but dissolved into the glare. Seen from above against the dead deep water, the dark back vanished into shadow. Whichever way you looked, from the lit layer or from the gloom, a mosasaur was hard to fix until it was already committed. The colour that hid them was the same colour the light and the dark handed them for free. Hold the whole scene together now, all its flaws at once. High up, the warm and moving light, the drifting ammonites, the straight pale rods of baculites, the turning schools of fish. Below them the patrolling sharks and the sliding mosasaurs, small ones threading the schools, larger shapes cruising the middle water, the seabirds stitching down from above and rising again to breathe, the great turtles passing through on their unhurried errands, and under all of it the endless soft fall of white, the coccolith snow drifting down out of the light and into the dark, settling on a floor gone still and cold and airless, building the chalk one grain at a time. It is a world you could almost stand inside. The temperature of bath water near the top and the chill of a deep well at the bottom, the smell of salt and living plankton in the bright layer, the flat mineral nothing of the stagnant deep, the taste of a sea slightly fresher than the ocean beyond it, fed by rivers off the western shore. Sound everywhere and silence nowhere, only the murmur growing fainter as you sank, until near the floor even that thinned to almost nothing, and left the pressure of passing bodies as the only news from above. Nothing about it was hurried. The snow fell at its own pace, the turtles rose and sank at theirs. The ammonites drifted where the water carried them, and the hunters kept their slow circuits through the layers, taking what the layers offered. Season folded into season, bloom into bloom, each dead cloud of algae adding its faint white line to the floor. A hunter took a fish in the bright water. A shell came to rest in the dark. The light returned each morning to the top of the column and never once reached the bottom. The whole vast room breathed at the surface and lay perfectly still beneath. And the record of it thickened, page on quiet page, in the chalk taking shape below. For roughly 25 million years this went on, birth and hunt and death folding quietly into the chalk, until one afternoon the sky itself changed. For roughly 25 million years this went on, birth and hunt and death folding quietly into the chalk, until one afternoon the sky itself changed. For roughly 25 million years this went on, birth and hunt and death folding quietly into the chalk, until one afternoon the sky itself changed. You would not have felt it as a beginning of anything. The light over the shallow sea shifted, the way light shifts before weather, and then it kept shifting, in a direction light was not supposed to go. Somewhere far to the south and west, off the edge of a low limestone peninsula that would one day be called the Yucatan, the ordinary machinery of the world had just been struck hard enough to stop. You have to understand how far away it was, and how little that distance mattered. The mosasaurs of the European Shelf Sea, the ones whose bones would surface centuries later beneath a Dutch hillside, were hundreds of miles from the point of impact, maybe thousands, and still it reached them. That is the strange arithmetic of what happened about 66 million years ago. A single afternoon in one shallow bay off one coastline became the last afternoon for creatures who had never seen that coast and never would. Picture the animal at the centre of all of this one last time before the world takes it away. A full-grown Mosasaurus hoffmanii, close to 46 feet from snout to the tip of its two-lobed tail, 10 to 15 tons of warm, dark muscle moving through sunlit water. Dark grey to black along the back, pale beneath, so that from below it vanished into the bright surface, and from above it dissolved into the depths. For its entire lineage it had been the thing other things watched for. Now it was simply an animal in the water, and the water was about to become a place that could not keep it. The impact left no witness among them, and that is worth saying plainly. Nothing in the sea understood what had happened. There was no warning that a creature could read, no shape on the horizon, no sound it could name. Whatever the mosasaurs sensed in those first hours, they sensed as animals sense weather, as a wrongness in the light and the water and the pressure. And then they went on doing what they had always done, hunting and breathing and rolling their long bodies forward, because that was all they knew how to do. Consider what the strike actually did, in the calmest terms. An object from space met the shallow sea and the rock beneath it off the Yucatan Peninsula, and the energy of that meeting did not stay local. It went into the air and into the sky and into the whole thin envelope of the planet. The event that opened the boundary between the Cretaceous and the age that followed, the layer geologists read as the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, was not a slow thing. It was one moment that the rock records as a line, a division you can put a finger on, everything below it one world and everything above it another. And here is the part that matters most for the animals in the water. The mosasaurs did not die because the asteroid reached across the sea and touched them. They died because the base of their world was pulled out from underneath them. Think of everything you have been told about how they lived. The great predators sat at the very top of the Cretaceous sea, and a top is only a top because of everything holding it up. Everything holding it up began, in the sunlit water of that last shallow sea, as something almost too small to picture. The chalk itself tells you this. The white beds still quarried near Maastricht today, the same rock that once gave up the great animal of Maastricht, were built grain by grain from coccoliths, the microscopic plates of planktonic algae drifting in the upper water. For millions of years that plankton had rained down as a soft white snow, a marine snow settling toward the dark bottom, feeding the fish, feeding everything that fed on fish. The base of the entire pyramid was that quiet green shimmer of life near the surface, turning sunlight into food. Take that light away, even for a season, and the pyramid has no floor. That is what the impact seems to have done. The sky filled with what the strike threw into it, and the sunlight that reached the sea thinned and failed, and the plankton that lived on that light could not make more of itself. The marine snow that had fallen without pause for 25 million years slowed, and when the snow slows, the fish that eat the plankton go hungry, and the larger fish that eat those fish go hungry, and higher the hunger climbs, one level at a time, until it reaches the animals who thought themselves untouchable. You can see then why size did not save them. Being 40 feet long and warm-blooded, carrying elevated body temperatures near 95 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit through cool water, being able to swallow prey whole with a double-hinged jaw, none of it was any defense against an empty sea. A large predator needs a great deal of food, and needs it steadily. The very thing that made Mosasaurus magnificent, its bulk, its metabolism, its place at the summit, was the thing that doomed it fastest. The bigger you are, the more the collapse costs you and the sooner you feel it. So the collapse did not spare the mosasaurs, and it did not spare their neighbours. The plesiosaurs went too, the long-necked swimmers that had shared these waters and these prey, that had cruised the open ocean more efficiently than any mosasaur ever could. Gone at the same boundary, in the same event. The ammonites went, the coiled placenticaras, and the straight-shelled baculites that had drifted through the midwater for so long that their shells are practically the signature of these seas. The diving birds went, the flightless Hesperornis that had broken the surface with a splash the mosasaurs would have known by feel. On the land beyond the coast, the non-avian dinosaurs went as well, the whole long dynasty of them ending in the same thin line of rock. It is a strange kind of company to keep, all of it vanishing together. You could stand at the edge of that sea, if you could stand there at all, and understand that you were watching not one death, but the unstitching of an entire fabric, every thread that had held the others in place letting go at once. The mosasaurs had spent their whole time on this planet as the answer to a full sea. When the sea emptied, there was no longer a question for them to answer. Now here is something worth resting on, because it complicates the simple picture, and the truth is usually more complicated than the simple picture. The mosasaurs were not entirely well when the sky changed. Their world had already been shifting under them slowly for a long time before the impact. The great inland sea that had defined so much of their range, the western interior seaway that once split North America clean in two, from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, was not a permanent feature of the Earth. It was a shallow drowning of a continent, an epicontinental sea, more like a warm, flooded lowland than a true ocean, and in its deepest reaches over what is now central Kansas, it went down only about 2,500 feet. A sea that shallow lives and dies at the mercy of small things. A little rise of the land, a little fall of the water, and its edges retreat for hundreds of miles. By the very end of the Cretaceous, that seaway was in retreat and in change. Rivers pouring in from the west carried fresh water into it, and the salinity of the whole basin began slowly to freshen. For an animal exquisitely tuned to a particular kind of water, a particular warmth and saltiness and depth, a slow freshening is not nothing. The seas were shifting, draining, reorganizing themselves across the face of the planet. The stage on which the mosasaurs had performed for 25 million years was being quietly struck even before the final curtain. So the honest way to tell it is this. The mosasaurs were already living in a changing world, on shrinking and freshening and rearranging seas, a dynasty perhaps past its widest reach when the impact came. The asteroid did not fell a lineage in perfect health. It felled a lineage that was already feeling the ground move, and it felled it in a single stroke that left no room for the slow adjustments that life usually gets to make. There was no time to migrate, no time to adapt, no time to shrink into some smaller, safer form. The door simply closed, and when it closed on all of them. Not one species of mosasaur is known to cross that boundary and go on into the world after. The whole family, from the small fish-hunting forms barely 14 feet long to the shell, crushing globidans with its rounded crushing teeth, from the ramming Tylosaurus with its long toothless snout to Mosasaurus hoffmanni itself, the largest and last and most complete of them, all of it ends at the same line in the rock. 25 million years of returning to the sea, of live birth out in open water, of jaws refined and eyes refined and bodies refined for the hunt, and it ends where the chalk turns over into the layer above. Let the size of that rain settle on you for a moment, because it is easy to say 25 million years and hear only a number. The mosasaur lineage was on this earth, as apex predators of the last great sea, for longer than there have been anything like modern humans by an enormous margin. Generation after generation, the newborns slipping into the water tail first the way the fossils show, growing, hunting, breeding, dying, folding down into the coccolith mud. And all of that, the whole long inheritance, comes to rest in a boundary you could cover with your hand. You might expect the end of something so large to be loud in the rock. It is not, particularly. That is one of the quiet lessons of this place. The most complete extinction of marine reptiles the world had seen is written not as a scream in the stone, but as an absence. Below the line, the fossils are there, the vertebrae and the paddle bones and the long tooth-studded jaws. Above the line, they are simply not. The animal that had been the certainty of these waters becomes, in the space of a single layer, a thing the sea no longer contains. I want to stay with that idea of absence, because the tone of an ending like this one is not really spectacle. We imagine the day of the impact as fire and wave and darkness, and some of that is surely true, but the mosasaurs do not experience the aftermath because the mosasaurs are gone. What remains is the quiet after. A sea that still moves, still holds light, still carries plankton in its upper water eventually, but no longer holds the great dark shapes that used to move beneath it. The water closes over the last of them the way water always closes without a mark and goes on. For a very long time after that, there was no one to know any of it had happened. The chalk kept forming where the sea still stood. The bones lay in it, pressed under the weight of everything that settled on top, held in the dark and the cold and the slow chemistry of stone. A dynasty that had ruled the Cretaceous oceans became something with no name and no witness. A shape in the rock waiting in a language nothing yet alive could read. This is where you should let yourself feel the strangeness of deep time, gently, the way you feel a large room in the dark. 66 million years is not a length you can hold in your mind honestly, but you can hold what it did. It took the mosasaurs, all of them, and it kept them. It turned an ecosystem into a library and then shelved the library so deep that the finding of even a single volume would one day be an event worth remembering. And it was, because the sea in the end did not erase them. It saved them. What the collapse took from the living world it handed without meaning to the rock, and the rock is patient in a way nothing alive can be. Across nearly every continent, mosasaur bone lies waiting in the old marine beds. Their fossils have been recovered on almost every landmass on Earth, including Antarctica, in rock that was once warm, shallow sea, and is now ice and stone at the bottom of the world. Wherever the last Cretaceous ocean stood, they left a deposit, and in the deposits the animals. The richest and most famous of those deposits you already half know, because it is where this whole long acquaintance began. Beneath a low hill in the southeast of the Netherlands near the town of Maastricht on the river the Romans called the Mosa and the Dutch called the Maas, the chalk of that vanished Maastrichtian sea was cut for building stone. In the 1760s and the 1770s, quarry workers in the underground galleries beneath Mount St. Peter struck the skulls of a great animal, jaws nearly 5 feet long lined with cone-shaped teeth, the great animal of Maastricht. That chalk, that hill, that river gave the genus its name, Mosasaurus, the lizard of the Meuse. The type specimen tradition of the largest of them all traces to those quarries and those years. Think about what that means for a moment. The name we use for the monster of the last great sea is not a name from its own time. It is a name from the place its bones were found, given long after the sea and the animal and the whole Cretaceous world were gone. We call it after a river that did not exist when it was alive. The animal never knew the Meuse. The Meuse is simply where the chalk that kept it came, at last, back into the light, and the chalk is still coming into the light. The beds beneath that Dutch hillside are the same white coccolith rock that has been quarried there for centuries, the compressed snow of a Cretaceous sea, and quarrying continues into the present day. Every so often the working of that stone turns up more of the animals it holds, a vertebra, a paddle, a jaw. The library keeps handing back its volumes, slowly, one at a time, on no schedule anyone can hurry. The sea finished with the mosasaurs 66 million years ago. The rock is not finished with them yet. There is a reason that first skull from Maastricht matters beyond its size, and it belongs here, at the end, more than anywhere. When the great animal of Maastricht was studied, in the early years of the 19th century, the naturalist Georges Cuvier looked at it and concluded, in 1808, that it was a giant extinct sea lizard, related to the monitor lizards but belonging to no living kind. That conclusion was not a small one. It became a cornerstone of his larger argument, the argument that extinction was real, that species could vanish utterly from the earth and never return, that the world had held creatures it no longer held. sit with the shape of that. The very animal that the impact erased at the end of the Cretaceous became, tens of millions of years later, one of the first proofs that such erasing was possible at all. The mosasaur helped teach us the meaning of its own ending. Before those chalk jaws were understood, extinction was an idea people resisted, because it seemed impossible that the world could simply lose things. The bones from Maastricht were part of how that resistance broke. In dying and in being kept, Mosasaurus handed the future the concept it needed to understand what had been lost. That is the quiet dignity of what the mosasaurs left behind in the rock. Not a warning, not a message, nothing they intended because they intended nothing. Just themselves, faithfully preserved, dark bodies turned to pale stone, and the slow accident of that preservation becoming knowledge. The soft tissue of a bilobed tail printed in a slab from Jordan. The melanosomes in fossil skin that told us they were dark above and pale below. The newborn bones out in the open ocean chalk of Kansas that told us they were born at sea. Every fact you have followed through these waters is a thing the rock chose to keep when the living world let go. So the great extinction, for all its scale, resolves at last into something you can almost hold in your hands. A layer of rock, a line you can put a finger on, below it a full sea, above it a quieter one, and scattered through the beds beneath that line, on nearly every continent, in Dutch chalk and Kansas chalk and the frozen margins of Antarctica, the pressed remains of the animals who ruled the water right up until the afternoon the sky changed. They do not need us to mourn them, and the calm of this place asks you not to. What they ask instead is simply to be noticed, the way you notice an empty room where something large used to stand. The mosasaurs are not tragic. They are finished, which is a different and gentler thing. They had their 25 million years, more than most lineages are given, and they spent every one of them as the certainty of the sea, and then the sea changed and they did not survive the change, and the rock took them in and held them safe. That is the whole arc of it, and it is enough. The sea that kept them is long gone too, of course. The western interior seaway drained away. The shallow Maastrichtian shelf retreated. The warm, shallow water that once covered so much of the continents pulled back to the ocean basins, and the chalk that had formed on those drowned lands was lifted up into hills and quarried into building stone, and the whole geography of that vanished world was rewritten so completely that you would never guess, standing on a Dutch hillside or a Kansas plain, that you were standing on a seabed at all. But the bones remember what the landscape forgot. Down in the pale rock, in the compressed snow of a plankton that died 66 million years ago, the shapes are still there, waiting with the endless patience of stone, a jaw, a paddle, a string of vertebrae the length of a long dark body, held in the dark, held in the cold, held flat under the weight of all the time that has passed, unhurried, unbothered, asking nothing. And so we come to the far end of it all, the sea empty, and the sky clearing at last on a world that no longer holds them, and the only trace left of the monster that ruled the last great sea is the quiet record pressed into the rock. Not everything about this animal has hardened into agreement. Some of it stays soft, still argued over in quiet papers, and the honesty of that is worth sitting with as you drift. Begin with size, because size is the question everyone asks first. The well-supported numbers come from real jaws and real skulls, and they cluster in a narrow band, roughly 39 to 46 feet from snout to tail tip. Picture a lane of highway, 4 car lengths of muscle and bone laid end to end. The heaviest individuals modelled from that frame weighed somewhere between 22,000 and 33,000 pounds, the mass of a loaded cement truck moving through the water without a sound. Those figures are steady. You can lean your weight on them. But there is a second set of numbers that stretches further, and it comes from fragments. Take a piece of a jaw, assume it belonged to a body built in the usual proportions, and multiply. Do that, and a few estimates climb toward 56 or even 59 feet. That is where the giant pieces from places like Penza, in Russia, enter the argument, jaw fragments larger than the well-measured skulls, tempting to scale up. Many researchers distrust that arithmetic. A jaw fragment is a thin thread to hang a whole body from, and the ratios used to guess the rest may inflate the answer. So the true maximum stretches and shrinks depending on which method you trust. Like a shadow that lengthens at dusk and pulls back in at noon. The largest figures are best held as speculation, not settled record. Then there is the question of family, of what this animal was, deep down beneath the paddles and the fluke. Mosasaurs came from small shore lizards, that much is agreed, but their closest living cousins are still contested. One reading of the skull and jaw sets them beside snakes, as a sister branch to the serpents. Another files them with the monitor lizards, the varanids, the heavy-bodied predators you might picture flicking a tongue across warm rock. Both readings have anatomy on their side. The flexible hinge partway along the lower jaw and the extra row of teeth on the roof of the mouth are traits shared with living snakes, and that resemblance pulls hard toward the serpents. Yet Cuvier himself, back in 1808, set the great Maastricht animal beside the monitors, and that reading has never fully let go. The cladistic analyses split. Some trees pull the lineage towards snakes, others toward monitors, and the two routes tug in opposite directions with no clear winner yet. Now watch the animal move, and notice that even this is debated. For close to 2 centuries the picture was simple. A long body sculling side to side, driven by the tail, the limbs folded back as steering paddles and little more. Then in 2019 a biomechanical study looked hard at the shoulder girdle, and found it unusually large and set low on the body, the kind of anchor that supports heavy fall-in muscle. From that came a new idea, that the animal added a breaststroke pulse of the front paddles to its tail-driven cruising, a burst of pull layered over the steady roll. It is a younger hypothesis, still being weighed against the old one, and neither has closed the case. What is clearer is where this animal sat among the great swimmers of its sea. Compare the cruising machines of the Mesozoic ocean, and the mosasaur does not take the top rank. That belongs to the ichthyosaurs, the tuna-shaped reptiles built for long, efficient distance. Behind them come the plesiosaurs, the long-necked or flippered hunters. The mosasaur ranks below both for sustained cruising, a sprinter more than a distant swimmer, capable of a sudden violent burst but not the tireless glide. Imagine a body that could explode across a short gap of water yet tire on the open crossing. Here, near the middle of our long walk through the last great sea, let me leave one soft request before we go deeper. If this quiet company helps you towards sleep, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let the words carry you on. Consider the animal's warmth next, the temperature of the blood moving under that dark skin. Here the evidence is real but indirect. Chemists have measured oxygen isotopes locked in mosasaur bone and compared them against the fish these reptiles swam among. The ratios point to elevated body temperatures, somewhere around 95 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and they stay elevated regardless of latitude, holding steady in cold seas as well as warm. That pattern is hard to explain in a cold-blooded animal that simply matches the water around it. It suggests a body generating and holding its own heat, a warm engine idling inside a cold ocean. But notice how that conclusion is reached. No one took the temperature of a living mosasaur. The warmth is inferred from chemistry sealed in stone, and from the texture of the bone, read backward across 66 million years. 2 separate isotope studies years apart agree that the temperatures were high. What they cannot yet fix is the degree of that heat and the machinery behind it, how the animal made and kept its warmth. So the field holds the idea gently, warm-blooded most likely in some sense. The full mechanism still an open room with the door left ajar. Even the name is unsettled, which surprises people. Over the long decades since the first Maastricht skull, more than 50 separate species were poured into the genus, a crowded drawer of specimens swept in whenever a jaw looked roughly right. A wastebasket, the taxonomists call such a genus, a bin that collects more than it should. In 2017, a careful redescription went through that drawer and narrowed it hard, pulling out the forms that never truly belonged. Yet the sorting is not finished. One species, known from fine Belgian material, is still argued over, whether it stands as its own animal or as merely the young or a variant form of the type species itself. The line between a real species and a growth stage of another can be thin, and here it has not been drawn to everyone's satisfaction. And then the smallest debate of all, written in the shells of the animals it may have eaten. Coiled ammonites drifted through these seas by the million, and some of their fossil shells carry neat round to oval holes punched clean through the wall. For years, two explanations competed. One said the holes were bite marks, the punctures of mosasaur teeth closing on the shell. The other said they were nothing so dramatic, only home scars, the resting hollows worn by limpets that had clamped onto the shell long after its owner died. Same hole, two very different accounts, one a hunt and one a quiet grazing. To weigh them, researchers laid out the shells and counted. More than 150 specimens of one ammonite from the rock of Alberta were examined together, the spacing and shape of the holes measured against the geometry of a mosasaur's jaw. The pattern matched a bite far more often than it matched a limpet, so the balance now tips toward predation, toward teeth, rather than resting mollusks for many of these shells. Yet the case is not fully closed. Individual specimens still get argued over, hole by hole, and a careful worker will tell you which ones remain in doubt. Sit for a moment with how much of this stays open. The exact upper size, uncertain. The nearest living cousin, uncertain. The stroke that drove the body still debated. The warmth of the blood, inferred and not measured. The boundaries of the genus redrawn but not final. The marks on the shells, mostly resolved yet not entirely. This is not weakness in the science, it is the science being honest about the width of what it does not yet know, refusing to paint certainty over a gap. And each of those open questions has the same address, not a laboratory argument that will settle itself by talk, but a better fossil, still unfound, still waiting in the layered rock. A more complete jaw would pin the size. A cleaner skeleton might close the family tree. A specimen preserved with its soft parts intact could show, once and for all, how the paddles pulled through the water. The answers are not lost. They are only buried, held in the chalk and the shale where the sea laid them down, patient far beyond any human hurry. What the sea kept of them, it kept in stone, pressed flat and patient, waiting for the light to reach it again. What the sea kept of them, it kept in stone, pressed flat and patient, waiting for the light to reach it again. And now, in the last quiet stretch of this long walk through deep time, let the light come slowly. Picture a single skull resting in pale chalk. Nearly 5 feet of jaw, lined with cone-shaped teeth, held in white stone the colour of old bone. It has waited a long time to be seen, longer than any story you know. Let your eyes rest on it, and let everything else grow soft around its edges. The teeth curve back toward the throat. You know now what that curve was for. To hold, to draw prey inward, to let nothing slip free once the jaws had closed. You have seen the second row of teeth on the roof of the mouth, the small hinge partway down the lower jaw that let it swallow what should have been too large. All of that machinery, still faintly legible in the rock. A hunter's face, gone quiet. No threat left in it now, only shape and time and the slow chemistry that turned an animal into a page. Let the view begin to widen. Pull back gently until the skull is only one pale mark in a wider bed of chalk. That chalk is made of the smallest things, countless coccoliths, the shells of drifting algae, each too small to see, settling like marine snow through the water for millions of years, a soft white rain that never stopped. It fell on the living and the dead alike, and it buried them both without hurry. The great animal and the plankton that fed its world lie folded into the same stone. Widen further. See the shallow floor of that vanished sea, hundreds of feet down in cold and oxygen-poor dark, where little moved but the settling sediment, and above it, the sunlit water, warm as the Gulf of Mexico is warm now, alive with fish and coiled ammonites and diving birds. Between those two layers the mosasaurs ruled, dark grey to black along the back, pale below, so that from beneath they vanished into the bright surface, and from above they melted into the deep. You could have been looking straight at one and never known. Draw the long threads together now, softly, the way a hand gathers loose cord. Remember where all of this began, not in the sea at all, but on a shore. Small semi-aquatic lizards, Aigalosaurs, moving between land and shallow water, no larger than animals you might hold in your arms. Nothing about them announced what would come. Yet somewhere in that lineage the shore fell away. The limbs softened into paddles. The tail grew a lower lobe and became a fluke that drove the body forward. The young were born live at sea, tail first into open water, so the mothers never needed to crawl back onto land again. A door closed quietly behind them, and the ocean became home. From that beginning came the whole spread of them. The small fish chasers, Platecarpus and Clidasts, threading through the shallows. Globidens with its bulbous rounded teeth, built to crush shells. Tylosaurus with its long solid snout, a generalist that ate almost anything, even other mosasaurs. And Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the great one, reaching perhaps 39 to 46 feet, and weighing in the largest bodies something near 10 to 15 tons. They divided the sea among themselves, each to its own prey, each to its own depth, and for roughly 25 million years the arrangement held. If you're still drifting here, still walking with me through this last soft stretch, you might follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. It costs you nothing, and it lets the quiet find you again another night. Nothing more is asked. Let it go, and let the sea widen once more. Pull the view back until whole coastlines come into frame. See the western interior seaway, the warm inland ocean that split North America in two, running from the Arctic down to the Gulf. See the shallow European shelf sea far to the east, where the chalk of Maastricht was slowly laid. These were not deep, wild oceans like the ones you know. They were drowned continents, warm and shallow and stacked with life, rimmed by low plains and river mouths that fed fresh water in from the land. In these mild seas the mosasaurs moved for age upon age, unhurried, unchallenged, the last great predators of the Cretaceous. And then, in a single day, the arrangement ended. An asteroid struck off the Yucatan at the place called Chicxulub about 66 million years ago. The same blow that ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs reached down into the sea and took the mosasaurs too, and the plesiosaurs with them. The warm, shallow oceans that had held them for so long went dark and cold and hungry, and the great jaws had nothing left to close on. A dynasty of 25 million years came to its end, not with struggle, but with a stillness that spread across every sea at once. What remained went into the rock, and only into the rock. The bones settled, the chalk kept falling, the teeth, the paddle bones, the small newborns once mistaken for birds, all of it pressed down into stone and waited. For 66 million years no eye fell on any of it. The seaway drained, the land rose, the chalk hardened into hills, and the animals slept inside it, folded flat and patient, holding their shape against all that time. Then, long after, the light reached one of them again, a skull, drawn out of a quarry beneath a chalk hill, nearly 5 feet of it, jaws and teeth intact. It became the first of its kind the world would ever puzzle over, the great animal of Maastricht. In time, a careful mind looked at it and understood that it belonged to no living creature, that its kind was truly gone, and that gone could be a real and final thing. From this one pale skull, the very idea of extinction took root. An animal that had vanished helped teach the living what vanishing means. Hold that thought lightly as the picture pulls back one last time. The skull in the chalk in the hill where a warm sea used to be, the sea where the great dark bodies used to roll and turn in the sunlit water. Layer inside layer, all of it quiet now, all of it still. You're looking down through more than 60 million years, and from up here it is only calm, only pale stone and the memory of warm water and the slow soft rain that built the rock. Take one deep breath and let the whole seaway grow small beneath you. The hunters that once ruled it will not stir. They have had their long reign and their long rest, and neither one troubles them now. Let them lie in the chalk where the ocean left them. Let the numbers loosen and drift off, the feet and the tons and the millions of years, until they are only a low hum at the edge of sleep. There is nothing left to watch for, nothing coming through the bright water. The great jaws are closed, and they will stay closed, and the calm is complete. Let the last of the light go soft. Let the pale sea and the pale stone and the sleeping shapes within, it all fade away together into the dark behind your eyes. You have walked a long way tonight, through warm, shallow oceans and cold, deep time, and now the walk is done. The chalk keeps them. The quiet keeps you. Rest here, where deep time is gentle and nothing more is asked of you. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.